Profit Over People, Neoliberalism and Global Order by Noam Chomsky. Audiobook presented by the Learner's Library. Contents. Introduction by Robert W. McChesney. Chapter 1 Neoliberalism and Global Order. Chapter 2 Consent Without Consent, Regimenting the Public Mind. Chapter 3 The Passion for Free Markets. Introduction by Robert W. McChesney. Neoliberalism is the defining political economic paradigm of our time. It refers to the policies and processes whereby a relative handful of private interests are permitted to control as much as possible of social life in order to maximize their personal profit. Associated initially with Reagan and Thatcher, for the past 2 decades neoliberalism has been the dominant global political economic trend adopted by political parties of the center and much of the traditional left as well as the right. These parties and the policies they enact represent the immediate interests of extremely wealthy investors and less than 1,000 large corporations. Aside from some academics and members of the business community, the term neoliberalism is largely unknown and unused by the public at large, especially in the United States. There, to the contrary, neoliberal initiatives are characterized as free market policies that encourage private enterprise and consumer choice, reward personal responsibility and entrepreneurial initiative, and undermine the dead hand of the incompetent, bureaucratic and parasitic government that can never do good even if well-intended, which it rarely is. A generation of corporate-financed public relations efforts has given these terms and ideas a near-sacred aura. As a result, the claims they make rarely require defense, and are invoked to rationalize anything from lowering taxes on the wealthy and scrapping environmental regulations to dismantling public education and social welfare programs. Indeed, any activity that might interfere with corporate domination of society is automatically suspect because it would interfere with the workings of the free market, which is advanced as the only rational, fair, and democratic allocator of goods and services. At their most eloquent, proponents of neoliberalism sound as if they are doing poor people, the environment, and everybody else a tremendous service as they enact policies on behalf of the wealthy few. The economic consequences of these policies have been the same just about everywhere, and exactly what one would expect: a massive increase in social and economic inequality, a marked increase in severe deprivation for the poorest nations and peoples of the world, a disastrous global environment, an unstable global economy, and an unprecedented bonanza for the wealthy. Confronted with these facts, defenders of the neoliberal order claim that the spoils of the good life will invariably spread to the broad mass of the population as long as the neoliberal policies that exacerbated these problems are not interfered with. In the end, neoliberals cannot and do not offer an empirical defense for the world they are making. To the contrary, they demand a religious faith in the infallibility of the unregulated market that draws upon 19th-century theories that have little connection to the actual world. The ultimate trump card for the defenders of neoliberalism, however, is that there is no alternative. Communist societies, social democracies, and even modest social welfare states like the United States have all failed, the neoliberals proclaim, and their citizens have accepted neoliberalism as the only feasible course. It may well be imperfect, but it is the only economic system possible. Earlier in the 20th century, some critics called fascism capitalism with the gloves off, meaning that fascism was pure capitalism without democratic rights and organizations. In fact, we know that fascism is vastly more complex than that. Neoliberalism, on the other hand, is indeed capitalism with the gloves off. It represents an era in which business forces are stronger and more aggressive, and face less organized opposition than ever before. In this political climate, they attempt to codify their political power on every possible front, and as a result, make it increasingly difficult to challenge businesses and next to impossible for non-market, non-commercial, and democratic forces to exist at all. It is precisely in its oppression of non-market forces that we see how neoliberalism operates not only as an economic system, but as a political and cultural system as well. Here the differences with fascism, with its contempt for formal democracy and highly mobilized social movements based upon racism and nationalism, are striking. Neoliberalism works best when there is formal electoral democracy, but when the population is diverted from the information, access, and public forums necessary for meaningful participation in decision-making. As neoliberal guru Milton Friedman put it in his Capitalism and Freedom, because profit-making is the essence of democracy, any government that pursues anti-market policies is being anti-democratic, no matter how much informed popular support they might enjoy. Therefore, it is best to restrict governments to the job of protecting private property and enforcing contracts, and to limit political debate to minor issues. The real matters of resource production and distribution and social organization should be determined by market forces. Equipped with this perverse understanding of democracy, neoliberals like Friedman had no qualms over the military overthrow of Chile's democratically elected Allende government in 1973, because Allende was interfering with business control of Chilean society. After 15 years of often brutal and savage dictatorship, all in the name of the democratic free market, formal democracy was restored in 1989 with a constitution that made it vastly more difficult, if not impossible, for the citizenry to challenge the business-military domination of Chilean society. That is neoliberal democracy in a nutshell: trivial debate over minor issues by parties that basically pursue the same pro-business policies regardless of formal differences and campaign debate. Democracy is permissible as long as the control of business is off-limits to popular deliberation or change, i.e. so long as it isn't democracy. The neoliberal system therefore has an important and necessary byproduct: a depoliticized citizenry marked by apathy and cynicism. If electoral democracy affects little of social life, it is irrational to devote much attention to it. In the United States, the spawning ground of neoliberal democracy, voter turnout in the 1998 congressional elections arguably was a record low, with just over one-third of eligible voters going to the polls. Although occasionally generating concern from those established parties like the U.S. Democratic Party that tend to attract the votes of the dispossessed, low voter turnout tends to be accepted and encouraged by the powers that be as a very good thing, since non-voters are, not surprisingly, disproportionately found among the poor and working class. Policies that could quickly increase voter interest and participation rates are stymied before ever getting into the public arena. In the United States, for example, the two main business-dominated parties, with the support of the corporate community, have refused to reform laws that make it virtually impossible to create new political parties that might appeal to non-business interests and let them be effective. Although there is marked and frequently observed dissatisfaction with the Republicans and Democrats, electoral politics is one area where notions of competition and free choice have little meaning. In some respects, the caliber of debate and choice in neoliberal elections tends to be closer to that of the one-party communist state than that of a genuine democracy. But this barely indicates neoliberalism's pernicious implications for a civic-centered political culture. On the one hand, the social inequality generated by neoliberal policies undermines any effort to realize the legal equality necessary to make democracy credible. Large corporations have resources to influence media and overwhelm the political process, and do so accordingly. In U.S. electoral politics, for just one example, the richest 1/4% of Americans make 80% of all individual political contributions, and corporations outspend labor by a margin of 10-1. Under neoliberalism, this all makes sense, as elections then reflect market principles, with contributions being equated with investments. As a result, it reinforces of the irrelevance of electoral politics to most people and assures the maintenance of unquestioned corporate rule. On the other hand, to be effective, democracy requires that people feel a connection to their fellow citizens, and that this connection manifests itself through a variety of non-market organizations and institutions. A vibrant political culture needs community groups, libraries, public schools, neighborhood organizations, cooperatives, public meeting places, voluntary associations, and trade unions to provide ways for citizens to meet, communicate, and interact with their fellow citizens. Neoliberal democracy, with its notion of the market über alles, takes dead aim at this sector. Instead of citizens, it produces consumers. Instead of communities, it produces shopping malls. The net result is an atomized society of disengaged individuals who feel demoralized and socially powerless. In sum, neoliberalism is the immediate and foremost enemy of genuine participatory democracy, not just in the United States but across the planet, and will be for the foreseeable future. It is fitting that Noam Chomsky is the leading intellectual figure in the world today in the battle for democracy and against neoliberalism. In the 1960s, Chomsky was a prominent U.S. critic of the Vietnam War, and, more broadly, he became perhaps the most trenchant analyst of the ways U.S. foreign policy undermines democracy, quashes human rights, and promotes the interest of the wealthy few. In the 1970s, Chomsky, along with his co-author Edward S. Herman, began their research on how the U.S. news media serve elite interests and undermine the capacity of the citizenry to actually rule their lives in a democratic fashion. Their 1988 book, Manufacturing Consent, remains the starting point for any serious inquiry into news media performance. Throughout these years, Chomsky, who could be characterized as an anarchist or, perhaps more accurately, a libertarian socialist, was a vocal, principled, and consistent democratic opponent and critic of communist and Leninist political states and parties. He educated countless people, including myself, that democracy is a non-negotiable cornerstone of any post-capitalist society worth living in or fighting for. At the same time, he has demonstrated the absurdity of equating capitalism with democracy, or of thinking that capitalist societies, even under the best of circumstances, will ever open access to information or decision-making beyond the most narrow and controlled possibilities. I doubt any author, aside from perhaps George Orwell, has approached Chomsky in systematically skewering the hypocrisy of rulers and ideologues in both communist and capitalist societies as they claim that theirs is the only form of true democracy available to humanity. In the 1990s, all of these strands of Chomsky's political work, from anti-imperialism and critical media analysis to writings on democracy and the labor movement, have come together, culminating in work like this book on democracy and the neoliberal threat. Chomsky has done much to reinvigorate an understanding of the social requirements for democracy, drawing upon the ancient Greeks as well as the leading thinkers of democratic revolutions in the 17th and 18th centuries. As he makes clear, it is impossible to be a proponent for participatory democracy and at the same time champion capitalism, or any other class-divided society. In assessing the real historical struggles for democracy, Chomsky also reveals how neoliberalism is hardly a new thing, but merely the current version of the battle for the wealthy few to circumscribe the political rights and civic powers of the many. Chomsky may also be the leading critic of the mythology of the natural free market, that cheery hymn that is pounded into our heads about how the economy is competitive, rational, efficient, and fair. As Chomsky points out, markets are almost never competitive. Most of the economy is dominated by massive corporations with tremendous control over their markets and that therefore face precious little competition of the sort described in economic textbooks and politicians' speeches. Moreover, corporations themselves are effectively totalitarian organizations, operating along non-democratic lines. That our economy is centered around such institutions severely compromises our ability to have a democratic society. The mythology of the free markets also submits that governments are inefficient institutions that should be limited so as not to hurt the magic of the natural laissez-faire market. In fact, as Chomsky emphasizes, governments are central to the modern capitalist system. They lavishly subsidize corporations and work to advance corporate interests on numerous fronts. The same corporations that exult in neoliberal ideology are in fact often hypocritical. They want and expect governments to funnel tax dollars to them, and to protect their markets for them from competition, but they want to assure that governments will not tax them or work supportively on behalf of non-business interests, especially on behalf of the poor and working class. Governments are bigger than ever, but under neoliberalism they have far less pretense to being concerned with addressing non-corporate interests. And nowhere is the centrality of governments and policymaking more apparent than in the emergence of the global market economy. What is presented by pro-business ideologues as the natural expansion of free markets across borders is, in fact, quite the opposite. Globalization is the result of powerful governments, especially that of the United States, pushing trade deals and other accords down the throats of the world's people to make it easier for corporations and the wealthy to dominate the economies of nations around the world without having obligations to the peoples of those nations. Nowhere is the process more apparent than in the creation of the World Trade Organization in the early 1990s, and, now, in the secret deliberations on behalf of the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, MAI. Indeed, it is the inability to have honest and candid discussions and debates about neoliberalism that is one of its most striking features. Chomsky's critique of the neoliberal order is effectively off-limits to mainstream analysis despite its empirical strength and because of its commitment to democratic values. Here, Chomsky's analysis of the doctrinal system in capitalist democracies is useful. The corporate news media, the PR industry, the academic ideologues, and the intellectual culture writ large play the central role of providing the necessary illusions to make this unpalatable situation appear rational, benevolent, and necessary if not necessarily desirable. As Chomsky hastens to point out, this is no formal conspiracy by powerful interests. It doesn't have to be. Through a variety of institutional mechanisms, signals are sent to intellectuals, pundits, and journalists pushing them to see the status quo as the best of all possible worlds, and away from challenging those who benefit from the status quo. Chomsky's work is a direct call for democratic activists to remake our media system so it can be opened up to anti-corporate, anti-neoliberal perspectives and inquiry. It is also a challenge to all intellectuals, or at least those who express a commitment to democracy, to take a long, hard look in the mirror and to ask themselves in whose interests, and for what values, do they do their work. Chomsky's description of the neoliberal corporate hold over our economy, polity, journalism, and culture is so powerful and overwhelming that for some readers it can produce a sense of resignation. In our demoralized political times, a few may go a step further and conclude that we are enmeshed in this regressive system because, alas, humanity is simply incapable of creating a more humane, egalitarian, and democratic social order. In fact, Chomsky's greatest contribution may well be his insistence upon the fundamental democratic inclinations of the world's peoples, and the revolutionary potential implicit in those impulses. The best evidence of this possibility is the extent to which corporate forces go to prevent there being genuine political democracy. The world's rulers understand implicitly that theirs is a system established to suit the needs of the few, not the many, and that the many cannot therefore ever be permitted to question and alter corporate rule. Even in the hobbled democracies that do exist, the corporate community works incessantly to see that important issues like the MAI are never publicly debated. And the business community spends a fortune bankrolling a PR apparatus to convince Americans that this is the best of all possible worlds. The time to worry about the possibility of social change for the better, by this logic, will be when the corporate community abandons PR and buying elections, permits a representative media, and is comfortable establishing a genuinely egalitarian participatory democracy because it no longer fears the power of the many. But there is no reason to think that day will ever come. Neoliberalism's loudest message is that there is no alternative to the status quo, and that humanity has reached its highest level. Chomsky points out that there have been several other periods designated as the end of history in the past. In the 1920s and 1950s, for example, US elites claimed that the system was working and that mass quiescence reflected widespread satisfaction with the status quo. Events shortly thereafter highlighted the silliness of those beliefs. I suspect that as soon as democratic forces record a few tangible victories, the blood will return to their veins, and talk of there being no possible hope for change will go the same route as all previous elite fantasies about their glorious rule being enshrined for a millennium. The notion that there can be no superior alternative to the status quo is more far-fetched today than ever, in this era when there are mind-boggling technologies for bettering the human condition. It is true that it remains unclear how to establish a viable, free, and humane post-capitalist order, and the very notion has a utopian air about it. But every advance in history, from ending slavery and establishing democracy to ending formal colonialism, has had to conquer the notion at some point that it was impossible to do because it had never been done before. And as Chomsky hastens to point out, organized political activism is responsible for the degree of democracy we have today, for universal adult suffrage, for women's rights, for trade unions, for civil rights, for the freedoms we do enjoy. Even if the notion of a post-capitalist society seems unattainable, we do know that human political activity can make the world we live in vastly more humane. And as we get to that point, perhaps we will again be able to think in terms of building a political economy based on principles of cooperation, equality, self-government, and individual freedom. Until then, the struggle for social change is not a hypothetical issue. The current neoliberal order has generated massive political and economic crises from East Asia to Eastern Europe and Latin America. The quality of life in the developed nations of Europe, Japan, and North America is fragile and the societies are in considerable turmoil. Tremendous upheaval is in the cards for the coming years and decades. There is considerable doubt about the outcome of that upheaval, however, and little reason to think it will automatically lead to a democratic and humane resolution. That will be determined by how we, the people, organize, respond, and act. As Chomsky says, if you act like there is no possibility of change for the better, you guarantee that there will be no change for the better. The choice is ours, the choice is yours. Robert W. McChesney, Madison, Wisconsin. Chapter 1. Neoliberalism and Global Order. I would like to discuss each of the topics mentioned in the title, Neoliberalism and Global Order. The issues are of great human significance and not very well understood. To deal with them sensibly, we have to begin by separating doctrine from reality. We often discover a considerable gap. The term neoliberalism suggests a system of principles that is both new and based on classical liberal ideas. Adam Smith is revered as the patron saint. The doctrinal system is also known as the Washington Consensus, which suggests something about global order. A closer look shows that the suggestion about global order is fairly accurate, but not the rest. The doctrines are not new, and the basic assumptions are far from those that have animated the liberal tradition since the Enlightenment. The Washington Consensus. The neoliberal Washington Consensus is an array of market-oriented principles designed by the government of the United States and the international financial institutions that it largely dominates, and implemented by them in various ways for the more vulnerable societies, often as stringent structural adjustment programs. The basic rules, in brief, are: liberalize trade and finance, let markets set price, get prices right, and inflation, macroeconomic stability, privatize. The government should get out of the way, hence the population too, insofar as the government is democratic, though the conclusion remains implicit. The decisions of those who impose the consensus naturally have a major impact on global order. Some analysts take a much stronger position. The international business press has referred to these institutions as the core of a de facto world government of a new imperial age. Whether accurate or not, this description serves to remind us that the governing institutions are not independent agents but reflect the distribution of power in the larger society. That has been a truism at least since Adam Smith, who pointed out that the principal architects of policy in England were merchants and manufacturers who used state power to serve their own interests, however grievous the effect on others, including the people of England. Smith's concern was the wealth of nations, but he understood that the national interest is largely a delusion. Within the nation there are sharply conflicting interests, and to understand policy and its effects we have to ask where power lies and how it is exercised, what later came to be called class analysis. The principal architects of the neoliberal Washington Consensus are the masters of the private economy, mainly huge corporations that control much of the international economy and have the means to dominate policy formation as well as the structuring of thought and opinion. The United States has a special role in the system for obvious reasons. To borrow the words of diplomatic historian Gerald Haynes, who is also senior historian of the CIA, following World War II the United States assumed, out of self-interest, responsibility for the welfare of the world capitalist system. Haynes is concerned with what he calls the Americanization of Brazil, but only as a special case. And his words are accurate enough. The United States had been the world's major economy long before World War II, and during the war it prospered while its rivals were severely weakened. The state-coordinated wartime economy was at last able to overcome the Great Depression. By the war's end, the United States had half of the world's wealth and a position of power without historical precedent. Naturally, the principal architects of policy intended to use this power to design a global system in their interests. High-level documents describe the primary threat to these interests, particularly in Latin America, as radical and nationalistic regimes that are responsive to popular pressures for immediate improvement in the low living standards of the masses and development for domestic needs. These tendencies conflict with the demand for a political and economic climate conducive to private investment, with adequate repatriation of profits and protection of our raw materials ours, even if located somewhere else. For such reasons, the influential planner George Kennan advised that we should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization, and must deal in straight power concepts, not hampered by idealistic slogans about altruism and world benefaction, though such slogans are fine, in fact obligatory, in public discourse. I am quoting The Secret Record, available now in principle, though largely unknown to the general public or the intellectual community. Radical nationalism is intolerable in itself, but it also poses a broader threat to stability, another phrase with a special meaning. As Washington prepared to overthrow Guatemala's first democratic government in 1954, a State Department official warned that Guatemala had become an increasing threat to the stability of Honduras and El Salvador. Its agrarian reform is a powerful propaganda weapon. Its broad social program of aiding the workers and peasants in a victorious struggle against the upper classes and large foreign enterprises has a strong appeal to the populations of Central American neighbors where similar conditions prevail. Stability means security for the upper classes and large foreign enterprises, whose welfare must be preserved. Such threats to the welfare of the world capitalist system justify terror and subversion to restore stability. One of the first tasks of the CIA was to take part in the large-scale effort to undermine democracy in Italy in 1948, when it was feared that elections might come out the wrong way. Direct military intervention was planned if the subversion failed. These are described as efforts to stabilize Italy. It is even possible to destabilize to achieve stability. Thus the editor of the quasi-official journal Foreign Affairs explains that Washington had to destabilize a freely elected Marxist government in Chile because we were determined to seek stability. With a proper education, one can overcome the apparent contradiction. Nationalist regimes that threaten stability are sometimes called rotten apples that might spoil the barrel, or viruses that might infect others. Italy in 1948 is one example. 25 years later, Henry Kissinger described Chile as a virus that might send the wrong messages about possibilities for social change, infecting others as far as Italy, still not stable even after years of major CIA programs to subvert Italian democracy. Viruses have to be destroyed and others protected from infection, for both tasks. Violence is often the most efficient means, leaving a gruesome trail of slaughter, terror, torture, and devastation. In secret post-war planning, each part of the world was assigned its specific role. Thus the major function of Southeast Asia was to provide raw materials for the industrial powers. Africa was to be exploited by Europe for its own recovery. And so on, through the world. In Latin America, Washington expected to be able to implement the Monroe Doctrine, but again in a special sense. President Wilson, famous for his idealism and high moral principles, agreed in secret that in its advocacy of the Monroe Doctrine the United States considers its own interests. The interests of Latin Americans are merely incidental, not our concern. He recognized that this may seem based on selfishness alone, but held that the doctrine had no higher or more generous motive. The United States sought to displace its traditional rivals, England and France, and establish a regional alliance under its control that was to stand apart from the world system, in which such arrangements were not to be permitted. The functions of Latin America were clarified at a hemispheric conference in February 1945, where Washington proposed an economic charter of the Americas that would eliminate economic nationalism in all its forms. Washington planners understood that it would not be easy to impose this principle. State Department documents warned that Latin Americans prefer policies designed to bring about a broader distribution of wealth and to raise the standard of living of the masses, and are convinced that the first beneficiaries of the development of a country's resources should be the people of that country. These ideas are unacceptable. The first beneficiaries of a country's resources are U.S. investors, while Latin America fulfills its service function without unreasonable concerns about general welfare or excessive industrial development that might infringe on U.S. interests. The position of the United States prevailed, though not without problems in the years that followed, addressed by means I need not review. As Europe and Japan recovered from wartime devastation, world order shifted to a tripolar pattern. The United States has retained its dominant role, though new challenges are arising, including European and East Asian competition in South America. The most important changes took place 25 years ago, when the Nixon administration dismantled the post-war global economic system, within which the United States was, in effect, the world's banker, a role it could no longer sustain. This unilateral act, to be sure, with the cooperation of other powers, led to a huge explosion of unregulated capital flows. Still more striking is the shift in the composition of the flow of capital. In 1971, 90% of international financial transactions were related to the real economy, trade or long-term investment, and 10% were speculative. By 1990 the percentages were reversed, and by 1995 about 95% of the vastly greater sums were speculative, with daily flows regularly exceeding the combined foreign exchange reserves of the 7 biggest industrial powers, over $1 trillion a day, and very short-term, about 80% with round trips of a week or less. Prominent economists warned over 20 years ago that the process would lead to a low-growth, low-wage economy, and suggested fairly simple measures that might prevent these consequences. But the principal architects of the Washington Consensus preferred the predictable effects, including very high profits. These effects were augmented by the short-term, sharp rise in oil prices and the telecommunications revolution, both related to the huge state sector of the U.S. economy, to which I will return. The so-called communist states were outside this global system. By the 1970s China was being reintegrated into it. The Soviet economy began to stagnate in the 1960s, and the whole rotten edifice collapsed 20 years later. The region is largely returning to its earlier status. Sectors that were part of the West are rejoining it, while most of the region is returning to its traditional service role, largely under the rule of former communist bureaucrats and other local associates of foreign enterprises, along with criminal syndicates. The pattern is familiar in the Third World, as are the outcomes. In Russia alone, a UNICEF inquiry in 1993 estimated that 500,000 extra deaths a year result from the neoliberal reforms, which it generally supports. Russia's social policy chief recently estimated that 25% of the population has fallen below subsistence levels, while the new rulers have gained enormous wealth, again the familiar patter of Western dependencies. Also familiar are the effects of the large-scale violence undertaken to ensure the welfare of the world capitalist system. A recent Jesuit conference in San Salvador pointed out that over time, the culture of terror domesticates the expectations of the majority. People may no longer even think about alternatives different from those of the powerful, who describe the outcome as a grand victory for freedom and democracy. These are some of the contours of the global order within which the Washington Consensus has been forged. The novelty of neoliberalism. Let us look more closely at the novelty of neoliberalism. A good place to start is a recent publication of the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, with survey articles on major issues and policies. One is devoted to the economics of development. The author, Paul Krugman, is a prominent figure in the field. He makes 5 central points, which bear directly on our question. First, knowledge about economic development is very limited. For the United States, for example, 2/3 of the rise in per capita income is unexplained. Similarly, the Asian success stories have followed paths that surely do not conform to what current orthodoxy says are the key to growth, Krugman points out. He recommends humility in policy formation, and caution about sweeping generalizations. His second point is that conclusions with little basis are constantly put forth and provide the doctrinal support for policy. The Washington Consensus is a case in point. His third point is that the conventional wisdom is unstable, regularly shifting to something else, perhaps the opposite of the latest phase, though its proponents are again full of confidence as they impose the new orthodoxy. His fourth point is that in retrospect, it is commonly agreed that the economic development policies did not serve their expressed goal and were based on bad ideas. Lastly, Krugman remarks, it is usually argued that bad ideas flourish because they are in the interest of powerful groups. Without doubt that happens. That it happens has been a commonplace at least since Adam Smith. And it happens with impressive consistency, even in the rich countries, though it is the Third World that provides the cruelest record. That is the heart of the matter. The bad ideas may not serve their expressed goals, but they typically turn out to be very good ideas for their principal architects. There have been many experiments in economic developments in the modern era, with regularities that are hard to ignore. One is that the designers tend to do quite well, though the subjects of the experiment often take a beating. The first major experiment was carried out 200 years ago, when the British rulers in India instituted the permanent settlement, which was going to do wondrous things. The results were reviewed by an official commission 40 years later, which concluded that the settlement fashioned with great care and deliberation has unfortunately subjected the lower classes to most grievous oppression, leaving misery that hardly finds a parallel in the history of commerce, as the bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India. But the experiment can hardly be written off as a failure. The British Governor-General observed that the permanent settlement, though a failure in many other respects and in most important essentials, has this great advantage, at least, of having created a vast body of rich landed proprietors deeply interested in the continuance of the British dominion and having complete command over the mass of the people. Another advantage was that British investors gained enormous wealth. India also financed 40% of Britain's trade deficit while providing a protected market for its manufacturing exports, contract labourers for British possessions, replacing earlier slave populations, and the opium that was the staple of Britain's exports to China. The opium trade was imposed on China by force, not the operations of the free market, just as the sacred principles of the market were overlooked when opium was barred from England. In brief, the first great experiment was a bad idea for the subjects, but not for the designers and local elites associated with them. This pattern continues until the present, placing profit over people. The consistency of the record is no less impressive than the rhetoric hailing the latest showcase for democracy and capitalism as an economic miracle and what the rhetoric regularly conceals. Brazil, for example. In the highly praised history of the Americanization of Brazil that I mentioned, Gerald Haynes writes that from 1945 the United States used Brazil as a testing area for modern scientific methods of industrial development based solidly on capitalism. The experiment was carried out with the best of intentions. Foreign investors benefited, but planners sincerely believed that the people of Brazil would benefit as well. I need not describe how they benefited as Brazil became the Latin American darling of the international business community under military rule, in the words of the business press, while the World Bank reported that 2/3 of the population did not have enough food for normal physical activity. Writing in 1989, Haynes describes America's Brazilian policies as enormously successful, a real American success story. 1989 was the golden year in the eyes of the business world, with profits tripling over 1988, while industrial wages, already among the lowest in the world, declined another 20%. The UN report on human development ranked Brazil next to Albania. When the disaster began to hit the wealthy as well, the modern scientific methods of development based solidly on capitalism, Haynes, suddenly became proofs of the evils of statism and socialism, another quick transition that takes place when needed. To appreciate the achievement, one must remember that Brazil has long been recognized to be one of the richest countries of the world, with enormous advantages, including half a century of dominance and tutelage by the United States with benign intent, which once again just happens to serve the profit of the few while leaving the majority of people in misery. The most recent example is Mexico. It was highly praised as a prize student of the rules of the Washington Consensus and offered as a model for others. As wages collapsed, poverty increased almost as fast as the number of billionaires, foreign capital flowed in, mostly speculative, or for exploitation of cheap labor kept under control by the brutal democracy. Also familiar is the collapse of the House of Cards in December 1994. Today half the population cannot obtain minimum food requirement, while the man who controls the corn market remains on the list of Mexico's billionaires, one category in which the country ranks high. Changes in global order have also made it possible to apply a version of the Washington Consensus at home. For most of the US population, incomes have stagnated or declined for 15 years along with working conditions and job security, continuing through economic recovery, an unprecedented phenomenon. Inequality has reached levels unknown for 70 years, far beyond other industrial countries. The United States has the highest level of child poverty of any industrial society, followed by the rest of the English-speaking world. So the record continues through the familiar list of third world maladies. Meanwhile, the business press cannot find adjectives exuberant enough to describe the dazzling and stupendous profit growth, though admittedly the rich face problems too. A headline in Business Week announces the problem now: what to do with all that cash, as surging profits are overflowing the coffers of corporate America, and dividends are booming. Profits remain spectacular through the mid-1996 figures, with remarkable profit growth for the world's largest corporations, though there is one area where global companies are not expanding much: payrolls. The leading business monthly adds quietly. That exception includes companies that had a terrific year with booming profits while they cut workforces, shifted to part-time workers with no benefits or security, and otherwise behaved exactly as one would expect with capital's clear subjugation of labor for 15 years, to borrow another phrase from the business press. How countries develop. The historical record offers further lessons. In the 18th century, the differences between the First and Third Worlds were far less sharp than they are today. Two obvious questions arise. 1. Which countries developed, and which not? 2. Can we identify some operative factors? The answer to the first question is fairly clear. Outside of Western Europe, two major regions developed, the United States and Japan, that is, the two regions that escaped European colonization. Japan's colonies are another case. Though Japan was a brutal colonial power, it did not rob its colonies but developed them, at about the same rate as Japan itself. What about Eastern Europe? In the 15th century, Europe began to divide, the West developing and the East becoming its service area, the original Third World. The divisions deepened into early in this century, when Russia extricated itself from the system. Despite Stalin's awesome atrocities and the terrible destruction of the wars, the Soviet system did undergo significant industrialization. It is the Second World, not part of the Third World, or was, until 1989. We know from the internal records that go into the 1960s, Western leaders feared that Russia's economic growth would inspire radical nationalism elsewhere, and that others too might be stricken by the disease that infected Russia in 1917, when it became unwilling to complement the industrial economies of the West, as a prestigious study group described the problem of communism in 1955. The Western invasion of 1918 was therefore a defensive action to protect the welfare of the world capitalist system, threatened by social changes within the service areas. And so it is described in respected scholarship. The Cold War logic recalls the case of Grenada or Guatemala, though the scale was so different that the conflicts took on a life of its own. It is not surprising that with the victory of the more powerful antagonist, traditional patterns are being restored. It should also come as no surprise that the Pentagon budget remains at Cold War levels and is now increasing, while Washington's international policies have barely changed, more facts that help us gain some insight into the realities of global order. Returning to the question of which countries developed, at least one conclusion seems reasonably clear. Development has been contingent on freedom from experiments based on the bad ideas that were very good ideas for the designers and their collaborators. That is no guarantee of success, but it does seem to have been a prerequisite for it. Let's turn to the second question. How did Europe and those who escaped its control succeed in developing? Part of the answer again seems clear, by radically violating approved free market doctrine. That conclusion holds from England to the East Asian growth area today, surely including the United States, the leader in protectionism from its origins. Standard economic history recognizes that state intervention has played a central role in economic growth. But its impact is underestimated because of too narrow a focus. To mention one major underestimated because of too narrow a focus. To mention one major omission, the Industrial Revolution relied on cheap cotton, mainly from the United States. It was kept cheap and available not by market forces, but by elimination of the indigenous population and slavery. There were of course other cotton producers. Prominent among them was India. Its resources flowed to England, while its own advanced textile industry was destroyed by British protectionism and force. Another case is Egypt, which took steps toward development at the same time as the United States but was blocked by British force, on the quite explicit grounds that Britain would not tolerate independent development in that region. New England, in contrast, was able to follow the path of the mother country, barring cheaper British textiles by very high tariffs as Britain had done to India. Without such measures, half of the emerging textile industry of New England would have been destroyed, economic historians estimate, with large-scale effects on industrial growth generally. A contemporary analogue is the energy on which advanced industrial economies rely. The golden age of post-war development relied on cheap and abundant oil, kept that way largely by threat or use of force. So matters continue. A large part of the Pentagon budget is devoted to keeping Middle East oil prices within a range that the United States and its energy companies consider appropriate. I know of only one technical study of the topic. It concludes that Pentagon expenditures amount to a subsidy of 30% of the market price of oil, demonstrating that the current view that fossil fuels are inexpensive is a complete fiction. the author concludes. Estimates of alleged efficiencies of trade, and conclusions about economic health and growth, are of limited validity if we ignore many such hidden costs. A group of prominent Japanese economists recently published a multi-volume review of Japan's programs of economic development since World War II. They point out that Japan rejected the neoliberal doctrines of their U.S. advisors, choosing instead a form of industrial policy that assigned a predominant role to the state. Market mechanisms were gradually introduced by the state bureaucracy and industrial financial conglomerates as prospects for commercial success increased. The rejection of orthodox economic precepts was a condition for the Japanese miracle, the economists conclude. The success is impressive. With virtually no resource base, Japan became the world's biggest manufacturing economy by the 1990s and the world's leading source of foreign investment, also accounting for half the world's net savings and financing U.S. deficits. As for Japan's former colonies, the major scholarly study of the U.S. aid mission in Taiwan found that U.S. advisors and Chinese planners disregarded the principles of Anglo-American economics and developed a state-centered strategy, relying on the active participation of the government in the economic activities of the island through deliberate plans and its supervisions of their execution. Meanwhile, U.S. officials were advertising Taiwan as a private enterprise success story. In South Korea, the entrepreneurial state functions differently, but with no less of a guiding hand. Right now, South Korea's entry into the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, the Rich Men's Club, is being delayed because of its unwillingness to rely on market-oriented policies, such as allowing takeovers by foreign companies and free movement of capital, much like its Japanese mentor, which did not permit capital export until its economy was well established. In a recent issue of the World Bank Research Observer, August 1996, the chair of Clinton's Council of Economic Advisers, Joseph Stiglitz, draws lessons from the East Asian miracle, among them that government took major responsibility for the promotion of economic growth, abandoning the religion that markets know best and intervening to enhance technology transfer, relative equality, education, and health, along with industrial planning and coordination. The UN Human Development Report 1996 stresses the vital importance of government policies in spreading skills and meeting basic social needs as a springboard for sustained economic growth. Neoliberal doctrines, whatever one thinks of them, undermine education and health, increase inequality, and reduce labor's share in income. That much is not seriously in doubt. A year later, after Asian economies were struck a severe blow by financial crises and market failures, Stiglitz, now chief economist of the World Bank, reiterated his conclusions, keynote address, updated, Annual World Bank Conference on Development Economics 1997, World Bank 1998, Wider Annual Lectures 2, 1998. The current crisis in East Asia is not a refutation of the East Asian miracle, he wrote. The basic facts remain. No other region in the world has ever had income rise so dramatically and seen so many people move out of poverty in such a short time. Their amazing achievements are highlighted by the tenfold growth per capita income in South Korea in 3 decades, an unprecedented success, with heavy doses of government involvement in violation of the Washington Consensus, but in accord with economic development in the US and Europe, he correctly adds. Far from a refutation of the East Asian miracle, he concluded, the serious financial turmoil in Asia may, in part, be the result of departing from the strategies that have served these countries so well, including well-regulated financial markets and abandonment of successful strategies in response to Western pressures, in no small measure. Other specialists have expressed similar views, often more forcefully. The comparison of East Asia and Latin America is striking. Latin America has the world's worst record for inequality, East Asia among the best. The same holds for education, health, and social welfare generally. Imports to Latin America are heavily skewed toward consumption for the rich, in East Asia, toward productive investment. Capital flight from Latin America has approached the scale of the crushing debt. In East Asia it had been tightly controlled until very recently. In Latin America, the wealthy are generally exempt from social obligations, including taxes. The problem of Latin America is not populism, Brazilian economist Bressa Pereira points out, but subjection of the state to the rich. East Asia differs sharply. Latin American economies have also been more open to foreign investments. Since the 1950s, foreign multinationals have controlled far larger shares of industrial production in Latin America than in the East Asian success stories, the UN Analysts of Trade and Development, UNCTAD, report. Even the World Bank concedes that the foreign investment and privatization it hails has tended to substitute for other capital flows in Latin America, transferring control and sending profits abroad. The bank also recognizes that prices in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan deviated more from market prices than those of India, Brazil, Mexico, Venezuela, and other alleged interventionists, while the most interventionist and price-distorting government of all, China, is the bank's favorite and fastest-growing borrower. And studies of the World Bank on the lessons of Chile have avoided the fact that nationalized copper firms are a major source of Chile's export revenues, to mention only one of many examples. It seems that openness to the international economy has carried a significant cost for Latin America, along with its failure to control capital and the rich, not just labor and the poor. Of course, sectors of the population benefit, as in the colonial era. The fact that they are as dedicated to the doctrines of the religion as foreign investors should come as no surprise. The role of state management and initiative in the successful economies should be a familiar story. A related question is how the Third World became what it is today. The issue is discussed by the eminent economic historian Paul Bairoch. In an important recent study, he points out that there is no doubt that the Third World's compulsory economic liberalism in the 19th century is a major element in explaining the delay in its industrialization and, in the very revealing case of India, the process of deindustrialization that converted the industrial workshop and trading center of the world to a deeply impoverished agricultural society suffering a sharp decline in real wages, food consumption, and availability of other simple commodities. India was only the first major casualty in a very long list, Bairoch observes, including even politically independent Third World countries that were forced to open their markets to Western products. Meanwhile, Western societies protected themselves from market discipline and developed varieties of neoliberal doctrine. That brings us to another important feature of modern history. Free market doctrine comes in two varieties. The first is the official doctrine imposed on the defenseless. The second is what we might call really existing free market doctrine. Market discipline is good for you, but not for me, except for temporary advantage. It is really existing doctrine that has reigned since the 17th century, when Britain emerged as Europe's most advanced developmental state, with radical increases in taxation and efficient public administration to organize the fiscal and military activities of the state, which became the largest single actor in the economy and its global expansion, according to British historian John Brewer. Britain did finally turn to liberal internationalism in 1846, after 150 years of protectionism, violence, and state power had placed it far ahead of any competitor. But the turn to the market had significant reservations. 40% of British textiles continued to go to colonized India, and much the same was true of British exports generally. British steel was kept from US markets by very high tariffs that enabled the United States to develop its own steel industry. But India and other colonies were still available, and remained so when British steel was priced out of international markets. India is an instructive case. It produced as much iron as all of Europe in the late 18th century, and British engineers were studying more advanced Indian steel manufacturing techniques in 1820 to try to close the technological gap. Bombay was producing locomotives at competitive levels when the railway boom began. But really existing free market doctrine destroyed these sectors of Indian industry just as it had destroyed textiles, shipbuilding, and other industries that were advanced by the standards of the day. The United States and Japan, in contrast, had escaped European control, and could adopt Britain's model of market interference. When Japanese competition proved to be too much to handle, England simply called off the game. The empire was effectively closed to Japanese exports, part of the background of World War II. Indian manufacturers asked for protection at the same time, but against England, not Japan. No such luck, under really existing free market doctrine. With the abandonment of its restricted version of laissez-faire in the 1930s, the British government turned to more direct intervention into the domestic economy as well. Within a few years, machine tool output increased 5 times, along with a boom in chemicals, steel, aerospace, and a host of new industries, An unsung new wave of industrial revolution, economic analyst Will Hutton writes. State-controlled industry enabled Britain to outproduce Germany during the war, even to narrow the gap with the US, which was then undergoing its own dramatic economic expansion as corporate managers took over the state-coordinated wartime economy. A century after England turned to a form of liberal internationalism, the United States followed the same course. After 150 years of protectionism and violence, the United States had become by far the richest and most powerful country in the world and, like England before it, came to perceive the merits of a level playing field, on which it could expect to crush any competitor. But like England, the United States had crucial reservations. One was that Washington used its power to bar independent development elsewhere, as England had done. In Latin America, Egypt, South Asia, and elsewhere, development was to be complementary, not competitive. There was also large-scale interference with trade. For example, Marshall Plan aid was tied to purchase of U.S. agricultural products, part of the reason why the U.S. share in world trade in grains increased from less than 10% before the war to more than half by 1950, while Argentine exports reduced by 2/3. U.S. Food for Peace aid was also used both to subsidize U.S. agribusiness and shipping and to undercut foreign producers, among other measures to prevent independent development. The virtual destruction of Colombia's wheat growing by such means is one of the factors in the growth of the drug industry, which has been further accelerated throughout the Andean region by the neoliberal policies of the past few years. Kenya's textile industry collapsed in 1994 when the Clinton administration imposed a quota, barring the path to development that has been followed by every industrial country, while African reformers are warned that they must make more progress in improving the conditions for business operations and sealing in free market reforms with trade and investment policies that meet the requirements of Western investors. These are only scattered illustrations. The most important departures from free market doctrine, however, lie elsewhere. One fundamental component of free trade theory is that public subsidies are not allowed. But after World War II, U.S. business leaders expected that the economy would head right back to depression without state intervention. They also insisted that advanced industry, specifically aircraft, though the conclusion was more general, cannot satisfactorily exist in a pure, competitive, unsubsidized, free enterprise economy and that the government is their only possible savior. I am quoting the major business press, which also recognized that the Pentagon system would be the best way to transfer costs to the public. They understood that social spending could play the same stimulative role, but it is not a direct subsidy to the corporate sector, it has democratizing effects, and it is redistributive. Military spending has none of these defects. It is also easy to sell. President Truman's Air Force Secretary put the matter simply: "We should not use the word subsidy," he said, "the word we should use is security." He made sure that the military budget would meet the requirements of the aircraft industry, as he put it. One consequence is that civilian aircraft is now the country's leading export, and the huge travel and tourism industry, aircraft-based, is the source of major profits. Thus it was quite appropriate for Clinton to choose Boeing as a model for companies across America as he preached his new vision of the free market future at the Asia-Pacific Summit in 1993, to much acclaim. A fine example of really existing markets, civilian aircraft production is now mostly in the hands of two firms, Boeing McDonnell and Airbus, each of which owes its existence and success to large-scale public subsidy. The same pattern prevails in computers and electronics generally, automation, biotechnology, communications, in fact just about every dynamic sector of the economy. There was no need to explain the doctrines of really existing free market capitalism to the Reagan administration. They were masters of the art, extolling the glories of the market to the poor while boasting proudly to the business world that Reagan had granted more import relief to U.S. industry than any of his predecessors in more than half a century, which is far too modest. They surpassed all predecessors combined, as they presided over the greatest swing toward protectionism since the 1930s, Foreign Affairs commented in a review of the decade. Without these and other extreme measures of market interference, it is doubtful that the steel, automotive, machine tool, or semiconductor industries would have survived Japanese competition, or been able to forge ahead in emerging technologies, with broad effects through the economy. That experience illustrates once again that the conventional wisdom is full of holes, another review of the Reagan record in Foreign Affairs points out. But the conventional wisdom retains its virtues as an ideological weapon to discipline the defenseless. The United States and Japan have both just announced major new programs for government funding of advanced technology, aircraft and semiconductors, respectively, to sustain the private industrial sector by public subsidy. To illustrate really existing free market theory with a different measure, an extensive study of transnational corporations, TNCs, by Winfried Ruegrock and Rob Van Tulder found that virtually all of the world's largest core firms have experienced a decisive influence from government policies and/or trade barriers on their strategy and competitive position, and at least 20 companies in the 1993 Fortune 100 would not have survived at all as independent companies, if they had not been saved by their respective governments, by socializing losses or by simple state takeover when they were in trouble. One is the leading employer in Gingrich's deeply conservative district, Lockheed, saved from collapse by huge government loan guarantees. The same study points out that government intervention, which has been the rule rather than the exception over the past 2 centuries, has played a key role in the development and diffusion of many product and process innovations, particularly in aerospace, electronics, modern agriculture, materials technologies, energy, and transportation technology, as well as telecommunications and information technologies generally. The Internet and World Wide Web are striking recent examples, and in earlier days, textiles and steel, and of course, energy. Government policies have been an overwhelming force in shaping the strategies and competitiveness of the world's largest firms. Other technical studies confirm these conclusions. There is much more to say about these matters, but one conclusion seems fairly clear: the approved doctrines are crafted and employed for reasons of power and profit. Contemporary experiments follow a familiar pattern when they take the form of socialism for the rich within a system of global corporate mercantilism in which trade consists in substantial measure of centrally managed transactions within single firms, huge institutions linked to their competitors by strategic alliances, all of them tyrannical in internal structure, designed to undermine democratic decision-making and to safeguard the masters from market discipline. It is the poor and defenseless who are to be instructed in these stern doctrines. We might also ask just how global the economy really is, and how much it might be subject to popular democratic control. In terms of trade, financial flows, and other measures, the economy is not more global than early in this century. Furthermore, TNCs rely heavily on public subsidies and domestic markets, and their international transactions, including those mislabeled trade, are largely within Europe, Japan, and the United States, where political measures are available without fear of military coups and the like. There is a great deal that is new and significant, but the belief that things are out of control is not very credible, even if we keep to existing mechanisms. Is it a law of nature that we must keep to these? Not if we take seriously the doctrines of classical liberalism. Adam Smith's praise of division of labor is well known, but not his denunciation of its inhuman effects, which will turn working people into objects as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to be, something that must be prevented in every improved and civilized society by government action to overcome the destructive force of their invisible hand. Also not well advertised is Smith's belief that government regulation in favor of the workman is always just and equitable, though not when in favor of the masters. Or his call for equality of outcome, which was at the heart of his argument for free markets. Other leading contributors to the classical liberal canon go much further. Wilhelm von Humboldt condemned wage labor itself. When the laborer works under external control, he wrote, "We may admire what he does, but we despise what he is." The art advances, the artisan recedes, Alexis de Tocqueville observed. Also a great figure of the liberal pantheon, Tocqueville agreed with Smith and Jefferson that equality of outcome is an important feature of a free and just society. 160 years ago, he warned of the dangers of a permanent inequality of conditions and an end to democracy if the manufacturing aristocracy which is growing up under our eyes in the United States, one of the harshest that has ever existed in the world, should escape its confines as it later did, beyond his worst nightmares. I am only barely touching on intricate and fascinating issues, which suggest, I think, that leading principles of classical liberalism receive their natural modern expression not in the neoliberal religion but in the independent movements of working people and the ideas and practices of the libertarian socialist movements, at times articulated also by such major figures of 20th-century thought as Bertrand Russell and John Dewey. One has to evaluate with caution the doctrines that dominate intellectual discourse, with careful attention to the argument, the facts, and the lessons of past and present history. It makes little sense to ask what is right for particular countries, as if these are entities with common interests and values. And what may be right for people in the United States, with their unparalleled advantages, could well be wrong for others who have a much narrower scope of choices. We can, however, reasonably anticipate that what is right for the people of the world will only by the remotest accident conform to the plans of the principal architects of policy. And there is no more reason now than there ever has been to permit them to shape the future in their own interests. A version of this article was originally published in South America in Spanish and Portuguese translations, 1996. Thanks for watching the Learner's Library. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe for more. Chapter 2. Consent without consent. Regimenting the public mind. A decent democratic society should be based on the principle of consent of the governed. That idea has one general acceptance, but it can be challenged as both too strong and too weak. Too strong, because it suggests that people must be governed and controlled. Too weak, because even the most brutal rulers require some measure of consent of the governed, and generally obtain it, not only by force. I am interested here in how the more free and democratic societies have dealt with these issues. Over the years, popular forces have sought to gain a larger share in managing their affairs, with some success alongside many defeats. Meanwhile, an instructive body of thought has been developed to justify elite resistance to democracy. Those who hope to understand the past and shape the future would do well to pay careful attention not only to the practice but also to the doctrinal framework that supports it. The issues were addressed 250 years ago by David Hume in classic work. Hume was intrigued by the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, the implicit submission with which men resign their fate to their rulers. This he found surprising, because force is always on the side of the governed. If people would realize that, they would rise up and overthrow the masters. He concluded that government is founded on control of opinion, a principle that extends to the most despotic and most military governments, as well as to the most free and most popular. Hume surely underestimated the effectiveness of brute force. A more accurate version is that the more free and popular a government, the more it becomes necessary to rely on control of opinion to ensure submission to the rulers. That people must submit is taken for granted pretty much across the spectrum. In a democracy, the governed have the right to consent, but nothing more than that. In the terminology of modern progressive thought, the population may be spectators, but not participants, apart from occasional choices among leaders representing authentic power. That is the political arena. The general population must be excluded entirely from the economic arena, where what happens in society is largely determined. Here the public is to have no role, according to prevailing democratic theory. These assumptions have been challenged throughout history, but the issues have taken on particular force since the first modern democratic upsurge in 17th century England. The turmoil of the time is often depicted as a conflict between king and parliament, but as is often true, a good part of the population did not want to be governed by either of the contestants for power but by countrymen like ourselves, that know our wants, so their pamphlets declared, "Not be knights and gentlemen who do not know the people's sores and will but oppress us." Such ideas greatly distressed the men of best quality, as they called themselves, the responsible men, in modern terminology. They were prepared to grant the people rights, but within limits, and on the principle that by the people we do not mean the confused and ignorant rabble. But how is that fundamental principle of social life to be reconciled with the doctrine of consent of the governed, which was not so easy to suppress by then? A solution to the problem was proposed by Hume's contemporary Francis Hutcheson, a distinguished moral philosopher. He argued that the principle of consent of the governed is not violated when the rulers impose plans that are rejected by the public, if later on the stupid and prejudiced masses will heartily consent to what we have done in their name. We can adopt the principle of consent without consent, the term used later by sociologist Franklin Henry Giddings. Hutcheson was concerned with control of the rabble at home, Giddings, with enforcing order abroad. He was writing about the Philippines, which the U.S. Army was liberating at the time, while also liberating several 100,000 souls from life sorrows or, as the press put it, slaughtering the natives in English fashion so that the misguided creatures who resist us will at least respect our arms and later come to recognize that we wish them liberty and happiness. To explain all of this in properly civilized tones, Giddings devised his concept of consent without consent. If in later years, the conquered people see and admit that the disputed relation was for the highest interest, it may be reasonably held that authority has been imposed with the consent of the governed, as when a parent prevents a child from running into a busy street. These explanations capture the real meaning of the doctrine of consent of the governed. The people must submit to their rulers, and it is enough if they give consent without consent. Within a tyrannical state or in foreign domains, force can be used. When the resources of violence are limited, the consent of the governed must be obtained by the devices called manufacture of consent by progressive and liberal opinion. The enormous public relations industry, from its origins early in this century, has been dedicated to the control of the public mind, as business leaders described the task. And they acted on their words, surely one of the central themes of modern history. The fact that the public relations industry has its roots and major centers in the country that is most free is exactly what we should expect, with a proper understanding of Hume's maxim. A few years after Hume and Hutcheson wrote, the problems caused by the rabble in England spread to the rebelling colonies of North America. The Founding Fathers repeated the sentiments of the British men of best quality in almost the same words. As one put it, when I mention the public, I mean to include only the rational part of it. The ignorant and vulgar are as unfit to judge of the modes of government as they are unable to manage its reins. The people are a great beast that must be tamed, his colleague Alexander Hamilton declared. Rebellious and independent farmers had to be taught, sometimes by force, that the ideals of the revolutionary pamphlets were not to be taken too seriously. The common people were not to be represented by countrymen like themselves, who know the people's sores, but by gentry, merchants, lawyers, and other responsible men who could be trusted to defend privilege. The reigning doctrine was expressed clearly by the President of the Continental Congress and first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay. The people who own the country ought to govern it. One issue remained to be settled: who owns the country? The question was answered by the rise of private corporations and structures devised to protect and support them, though it remains a difficult task to compel the public to keep to the spectator role. The United States is surely the most important case to study if we hope to understand the world of today and tomorrow. One reason is its incomparable power. Another is its stable democratic institutions. Furthermore, the United States was as close to a tabula rasa as one can find. America can be as happy as she pleases, Thomas Paine remarked in 1776, she has a blank sheet to write upon. The indigenous societies were largely eliminated. The US also has little residue of earlier European structures, one reason for the relative weakness of the social contract and of support systems, which often had their roots in pre-capitalist institutions. And to an unusual extent, the socio-political order was consciously designed. In studying history, one cannot construct experiments, but the United States is as close to the ideal case of state capitalist democracy as can be found. The main designer, furthermore, was an astute political thinker, James Madison, whose views largely prevailed. In the Debated on the Constitution, Madison pointed out that if elections in England were open to all classes of people, the property of landed proprietors would be insecure. An agrarian law would soon take place, giving land to the landless. The constitutional system must be designed to prevent such injustice and secure the permanent interests of the country, which are property rights. Among Madisonian scholars, there is a consensus that the Constitution was intrinsically an aristocratic document designed to check the democratic tendencies of the period, delivering power to a better sort of people and excluding those who were not rich, well-born, or prominent from exercising political power. Lance Banning. The primary responsibility of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority, Madison declared. That has been the guiding principle of the democratic system from its origins until today. In public discussion, Madison spoke of the rights of minorities in general, but it is quite clear that he had a particular minority in mind, the minority of the opulent. Modern political theory stresses Madison's belief that in a just and free government the rights of both the property and of the persons ought to be effectually guarded. But in this case too it is useful to look at the doctrine more carefully. There are no rights of property, only rights to property, that is, rights of persons with property. Perhaps I have a right to my car, but my car has no rights. The right to property also differs from others in that one person's possession of property deprives another of that right. If I own my care, you do not, but in a just and free society, my freedom of speech would not limit yours. The Madisonian principle, then, is that government must guard the rights of persons generally, but must provide special and additional guarantees for the rights of one class of persons, property owners. Madison foresaw that the threat of democracy was likely to become more severe over time because of the increase in the proportion of those who will labor under all the hardships of life, and secretly sigh for a more equal distribution of its blessings. They might gain influence, Madison feared. He was concerned by the symptoms of leveling spirit that had already appeared, and warned of the future danger if the right to vote would place power over property in hands without a share in it. Those without property, or the hope of acquiring it, cannot be expected to sympathize sufficiently with its rights, Madison explained. His solution was to keep political power in the hands of those who come from and represent the wealth of the nation, the more capable set of men, with the general public fragmented and disorganized. The problem of a leveling spirit also arises abroad, of course. We learn a lot about really existing democratic theory by seeing how this problem is perceived, particularly in secret internal documents, where leaders can be more frank and open. Take the important example of Brazil, the Colossus of the South. On a visit in 1960, President Eisenhower assured Brazilians that our socially conscious private enterprise system benefits all the people, owners and workers alike. In freedom, the Brazilian worker is happily demonstrating the joys of life under a democratic system. The ambassador added that U.S. influence had broken down the old order in South America by bringing to it such revolutionary ideas as free compulsory education, equality before the law, a relatively classless society, a responsible democratic system of government, free competitive enterprise, and a fabulous state of living for the masses. But Brazilians reacted harshly to the good news brought by their northern tutors. Latin American elites are like children, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles informed the National Security Council, with practically no capacity for self-government. Worse still, the United States is hopelessly far behind the Soviets in developing controls over the minds and emotions of unsophisticated peoples. Dulles and Eisenhower expressed their concern over the communist ability to get control of mass movements, an ability that we have no capacity to duplicate. The poor people are the ones they appeal to, and they have always wanted to plunder the rich. In other words, we find it hard to induce people to accept our doctrine that the rich should plunder the poor, a public relations problem that had not yet been solved. The Kennedy administration faced the problem by shifting the mission of the Latin American military from hemispheric defense to internal security, a decision with fateful consequences, beginning with the brutal and murderous military coup in Brazil. The military had been seen by Washington as an island of sanity in Brazil, and the coup was welcomed by Kennedy's ambassador, Lincoln Gordon, as a democratic rebellion, indeed the single most decisive victory of freedom in the mid-20th century. A former Harvard University economist, Gordon added that this victory of freedom, that is, the violent overthrow of parliamentary democracy, should create a greatly improved climate for private investments, giving some further insight into the operative meaning of the terms freedom and democracy. 2 years later, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara informed his associates that U.S. policies toward the Latin American military have, on the whole, been effective in attaining the goals set for them. These policies had improved internal security capabilities and established predominant U.S. military influence. The Latin American military understand their tasks and are equipped to pursue them, thanks to Kennedy's programs of military aid and training. These tasks include the overthrow of civilian governments whenever, in the judgment of the military, the conduct of these leaders is injurious to the welfare of the nation. Such actions by the military are necessary in the Latin American cultural environment, the Kennedy intellectuals explained. And we can be confident that they will be carried out properly, now that the military have gained an understanding of, and orientation toward, U.S. objectives. that assures a proper outcome to the revolutionary struggle for power among major groups which constitute the present class structure in Latin America, an outcome that will protect private U.S. investment and trade, the economic route that is at the heart of U.S. political interest in Latin America. These are secret documents, in this case, of Kennedy liberalism. Public discourse is naturally quite different. If we keep to it, we will understand little about the true meaning of democracy, or about the global order of the past years, and the future as well, since the same hands hold the reins. The more serious scholarship is clear about the basic facts. The national security states installed and backed by the United States are discussed in an important book by Lars Schultz, one of the leading Latin American scholars. Their goal, in his words, was to destroy permanently a perceived threat to the existing structure of socio-economic privilege by eliminating the political participation of the numerical majority, Hamilton's great beast. The goal is basically the same in the home society, though the means are different. The pattern continues today. The champion human rights violator in the hemisphere is Colombia, also the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and training in recent years. The pretext is the drug war, but that is a myth, as regularly reported by major human rights groups, the Church, and others who have investigated the shocking record of atrocities and the close links between the narco-traffickers, landowners, the military, and their paramilitary associates. State terror has devastated popular organizations and virtually destroyed the one independent political party by assassination of thousands of activists, including presidential candidates, mayors, and others. Nonetheless, Colombia is hailed as a stable democracy, revealing again what is meant by democracy. A particularly instructive example is the reaction to Guatemala's first experiment with democracy. In this case, the secret record is partially available, so we know a good deal about the thinking that guided policy. In 1952, the CIA warned that the radical and nationalist policies of the government had gained the support or acquiescence of almost all Guatemalans. The government was mobilizing the hitherto politically inert peasantry and creating mass support for the present regime by means of labor organization, agrarian reform, and other policies identified with the Revolution of 1944, which had aroused a strong national movement to free Guatemala from the military dictatorship, social backwardness, and economic colonialism which had been the pattern of the past. The policies of the democratic government inspired the loyalty and conformed to the self-interest of most politically conscious Guatemalans. State Department intelligence reported that the democratic leadership insisted upon the maintenance of an open political system, thus allowing communists to expand their operations and appeal effectively to various sectors of the population. These deficiencies of democracy were cured by the military coup of 1954 and the reign of terror since, always with large-scale U.S. support. The problem of securing consent has also arisen with international institutions. At first, the United Nations was a reliable instrument of the U.S. policy, and was greatly admired. But decolonization brought about what came to be called the tyranny of the majority. From the 1960s, Washington took the lead in vetoing Security Council resolutions, with Britain second, and France a distant third, and voting alone or with a few client states against General Assembly resolutions. The UN fell into disfavor, and sober articles began to appear asking why the world was opposing the United States. That the United States might be opposing the world is thought too bizarre to be entertained. U.S. relations with the World Court and other international institutions have undergone a similar evolution, to which we return. My comments on the Madisonian roots of the prevailing concepts of democracy were unfair in an important respect. Like Adam Smith and other founders of classical liberalism, Madison was pre-capitalist, and anti-capitalist in spirit. He expected that the rulers would be enlightened statesmen and benevolent philosophers, whose wisdom may best discern the true interests of their country. They would refine and enlarge the public views, guarding the true interests of the country against the mischiefs of democratic majorities, but with enlightenment and benevolence. Madison soon learned differently, as the opulent minority proceeded to use their newfound power as much as Adam Smith had predicted a few years earlier. They were intent on pursuing what Smith called the vile maxim of the masters, all for ourselves, and nothing for other people. By 1792, Madison warned that the rising developmental capitalist state was substituting the motive of private interest in place of public duty, leading to a real domination of the few under an apparent liberty of the many. He deplored the daring depravity of the times, as private powers become the Praetorian band of the government, at once its tools and its tyrant, bribed by its largesses, and overawing it by clamors and combinations. They cast over society the shadow that we call politics, as John Dewey later commented. One of the major 20th century philosophers and a leading figure of North American liberalism, Dewey emphasized that democracy has little content when big business rules the life of the country through its control of the means of production, exchange, publicity, transportation, and communications, reinforced by command of the press agents, and other means of publicity and propaganda. He held further that in a free and democratic society, workers must be the masters of their own industrial fate, not tools rented by employers, ideas that can be traced back to classical liberalism and the Enlightenment, and have constantly reappeared in popular struggle in the United States as elsewhere. There have been many changes in the past 200 years, but Madison's words of warning have only become more appropriate, taking new meaning with the establishment of great private tyrannies that were granted extraordinary powers early in this century, primarily by the courts. The theories devised to justify these collectivist legal entities, as they are sometimes called by legal historians, are based on ideas that also underlie fascism and Bolshevism, that organic entities have rights over and above those of persons. They receive ample largesses from the states they largely dominate, remaining both tools and tyrants, in Madison's phrase. And they have gained substantial control over the domestic and international economy as well as the informational and doctrinal systems, bringing to mind another of Madison's concerns, that a popular government, without popular information, or the means of acquiring it, is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Let's now look at the doctrines that have been crafted to impose the modern forms of political democracy. They are expressed quite accurately in an important manual of the public relations industry by one of its leading figures, Edward Bernays. He opens by observing that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. To carry out this essential task, the intelligent minorities must make use of propaganda continuously and systematically, because they alone understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses and can pull the wires which control the public mind. Therefore, our society has consented to permit free competition to be organized by leadership and propaganda, another case of consent without consent. Propaganda provides the leadership with a mechanism to mold the mind of the masses so that they will throw their newly gained strength in the desired direction. The leadership can regiment the public mind every bit as much as an army regiments the bodies of its soldiers. This process of engineering consent is the very essence of the democratic process, Bernays wrote shortly before he was honored for his contributions by the American Psychological Association in 1949. The importance of controlling the public mind has been recognized with increasing clarity as popular struggles succeeded in extending the modalities of democracy, thus giving rise to what liberal elites call the crisis of democracy, as when normally passive and apathetic populations become organized and seek to enter the political arena to pursue their interests and demands, threatening stability and order. As Bernays explained the problem, with universal suffrage and universal schooling, at last even the bourgeoisie stood in fear of the common people. For the masses promised to become king, a tendency fortunately reversed, so it has been hoped, as new methods to mold the mind of the masses were devised and implemented. A good New Deal liberal, Bernays had developed his skills in Woodrow Wilson's Committee on Public Information, the first U.S. state propaganda agency. It was the astounding success of propaganda during the war that opened the eyes of the intelligent few in all departments of life to the possibilities of regimenting the public mind, Bernays explained in his public relations manual, entitled Propaganda. The intelligent few were perhaps unaware that their astounding success relied in no small part on propaganda fabrications about Hun atrocities provided to them by the British Ministry of Information, which secretly defined its task as to direct the thought of most of the world. All of this is good Wilsonian doctrine, known as Wilsonian idealism in political theory. Wilson's own view was that an elite of gentlemen with elevated ideals is needed to preserve stability and righteousness. It is the intelligent minority of responsible men who must control decision-making, another veteran of Wilson's propaganda committee, Walter Lippmann, explained in his influential essays on democracy. Lippmann was also the most respected figure in U.S. journalism and a noted commentator on public affairs for half a century. The intelligent minority are a specialized class who are responsible for setting policy and for the formation of a sound public opinion, Lippmann elaborated. They must be free from interference by the general public, who are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. The public must be put in its place, Lippmann continued. Their function is to be spectators of action, not participants, apart from periodic electoral exercises when they choose among the specialized class. Leaders must be free to operate in technocratic insulation, to borrow current World Bank terminology. In the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, Harold Larswell, one of the founders of modern political science, warned that the intelligent few must recognize the ignorance and stupidity of the masses and not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. They are not the best judges, we are. The masses must be controlled for their own good, and in more democratic societies, where force is unavailable, social managers must turn to a whole new technique of control, largely through propaganda. Note that this is a good Leninist doctrine. The similarity between progressive democratic theory and Marxism-Leninism is rather striking, something that Bakunin had predicted long before. With a proper understand of the concept of consent, we can see that implementation of the business agenda over the objections of the general public is with the consent of the governed, a form of consent without consent. That is a fair description of what has been happening in the United States. There is often a gap between public preferences and public policy. In recent years, the gap has become substantial. A comparison sheds further light on the functioning of the democratic system. More than 80% of the public think that the government is run for the benefit of the few and the special interests, not the people, up from about 50% in earlier years. Over 80% believe that the economic system is inherently unfair, and that working people have too little say in what goes on in the country. More than 70% feel that business has gained too much power over too many aspects of American life. And by almost 20-1, the public believe that corporations should sometimes sacrifice some profit for the sake of making things better for their workers and communities. Public attitudes remain stubbornly social democratic in important respects, as they did through the Reagan years, contrary to a good deal of mythology. But we should also note that these attitudes fall far short of the ideas that animated the democratic revolutions. Working people of 19th-century North America did not plead with their rulers to be more benevolent. Rather, they denied their right to rule. Those who work in the mills should own them, the labor press demanded, upholding the ideals of the American Revolution as the dangerous rabble understood them. The 1994 congressional election is a revealing example of the gap between rhetoric and fact. It was called a political earthquake, a landslide victory, a triumph of conservatism that reflects the continuing drift to the right as voters gave an overwhelming popular mandate to Newt Gingrich's ultra-right army, who promised to get government off our backs and bring back the happy days when the free market reigned. Turning to the facts, the landslide victory was won with barely more than half the votes cast, about 20% of the electorate, figures that hardly differ from 2 years earlier, when the Democrats won. 1 out of 6 voters described the outcome as an affirmation of the Republican agenda. 1 out of 4 had heard of the contract with America, which presented that agenda. And when informed, the population opposed virtually all of it by majorities. About 60% of the public wanted social spending increased. A year later, 80% held that the federal government must protect the most vulnerable in society, especially the poor and the elderly, by guaranteeing minimum living standards and providing social benefits. 80 to 90% of Americans support federal guarantees of public assistance for those who cannot work, unemployment insurance, subsidized prescription drugs and nursing home care for the elderly, a minimum level of health care, and social security. 3/4 support federally guaranteed child care for low-income working mothers. The resilience of such attitudes is particularly striking in the light of the unremitting propaganda assault to persuade the public that they hold radically different beliefs. Public opinion studies show that the more voters learned about the Republican program in Congress, the more they opposed the party and its congressional program. The standard-bearer of the revolution, Newt Gingrich, was unpopular at the time of his triumph, and sank steadily afterward, becoming perhaps the most unpopular political figure in the country. One of the more comical aspects of the 1996 elections was the scene of Gingrich's closest associates struggling to deny any connection to their leader and his ideas. In the primaries, the first candidate to disappear, virtually at once, was Phil Gramm, the sole representative of the congressional Republicans, very well funded and saying all the words that the voters are supposed to love, according to the headlines. In fact, almost the full range of policy issues disappeared instantly as soon as the candidates had to face the voters in January 1996. The most dramatic example was balancing the budget. Through 1995, the major issue in the country was how quickly to do it, 7 years or a bit longer. The government was shut down several times as the controversy raged. As soon as the primaries opened, talk of the budget was gone. The Wall Street Journal reported with surprise that voters have abandoned their balanced budget obsession. The actual obsession of the voters was precisely the opposite, as polls had regularly shown, their opposition to balancing the budget under any minimally realistic assumptions. To be accurate, parts of the public did share the obsession of both political parties with balancing the budget. In August 1995, the deficit was chosen as the country's most important problem by 5% of the population, ranking alongside homelessness. But the 5% who were obsessed with the budget happened to include people who matter. American business has spoken. Balance the federal budget, Business Week announced, reporting a poll of senior executives. And when business speaks, so do the political class and the media, which informed the public that it demanded a balanced budget, detailing the cuts in social spending in accord with the public will and over its substantial opposition, as polls demonstrated. It is not surprising that the topic suddenly disappeared from view as soon as politicians had to face the great beast. It is also not surprising that the agenda continues to be implemented in its standard double-edged fashion, with cruel and often unpopular cuts in social spending alongside increases in the Pentagon budget that the public opposes, but with strong business support in both cases. The reasons for the spending increases are easily understood when we bear in mind the domestic role of the Pentagon system, to transfer public funds to advanced sectors of industry, so that Newt Gingrich's rich constituents, for example, can be protected from the rigors of the marketplace with more government subsidies than any other suburban district in the country, outside the federal government itself, while the leader of the conservative revolution denounces big government and Lord's rugged individualism. From the beginning, it was clear from the polls that the stories about the conservative landslide were untrue. Now the fraud is quietly conceded. The polling specialist of the Gingrich Republicans explained that when he reported that most people supported the contract with America, what he meant was that they liked the slogans that were used for packaging. For example, his studies showed that the public opposes dismantling the health system and wants to preserve, protect and strengthen it for the next generation. So dismantling is packaged as a solution that preserves and protects the health system for the next generation. The same is true generally. All of this is very natural in a society that is, to an unusual degree, business-run, with huge expenditures on marketing. $1 trillion a year, 1/6 of gross domestic product, much of it tax-deductible, so that people pay for the privilege of being subjected to manipulation of their attitudes and behavior. But the great beast is hard to tame. Repeatedly it has been thought that the problem has been solved, and that the end of history has been reached in a kind of utopia of the masters. One classic moment was at the origins of neoliberal doctrine in the early 19th century, when David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, and other great figures of classical economics announced that the new science had proven, with the certainty of Newton's laws, that we only harm the poor by trying to help them, and that the best gift we can offer the suffering masses is to free them from the delusion that they have a right to live. The new science proved that people had no rights beyond what they can obtain in the unregulated labor market. By the 1830s it seemed that these doctrines had won the day in England. With the triumph of right thinking at the service of British manufacturing and financial interests, the people of England were forced into the paths of a utopian experiment, Carl Polanyi wrote in his classic work, The Great Transformation, 50 years ago. It was the most ruthless act of social reform in all of history, he continued, which crushed multitudes of lives. But an unanticipated problem arose. The stupid masses began to draw the conclusion that if we have no right to live, then you have no right to rule. The British Army had to cope with riots and disorder, and soon an even greater threat took shape as workers began to organize, demanding factory laws and social legislation to protect them from the harsh neoliberal experiment, and often going well beyond. The science, which is fortunately flexible, took new forms as elite opinion shifted in response to uncontrollable popular forces, discovering that the right to live had to be preserved under a social contract of sorts. Later in the century, it seemed to many that order had been restored, though a few dissented. The famous artist William Morris outraged respectable opinion by declaring himself a socialist in a talk at Oxford. He recognized that it was the received opinion that the competitive or devil-take-the-hindmost system is the last system of economy which the world will see, that it is perfection, and therefore finality has been reached in it. But if history really is at an end, he continued, then civilization will die. And this he refused to believe, despite the confident proclamations of the most learned men. He was right, as popular struggle demonstrated. In the United States too, the gay 90s a century ago were hailed as perfection and finality. And by the Roaring Twenties, it was confidently assumed that labor had been crushed for good, and the utopia of the masters achieved in a most undemocratic America that was created over its workers' protest, Yale University historian David Montgomery comments. But again the celebration was premature. Within a few years the great beast once again escaped its cage, and even the United States, the business-run society par excellence, was forced by popular struggle to grant rights that had long ago been won in far more autocratic societies. Immediately after World War II, business launched a huge propaganda offensive to regain what it had lost. By the late 1950s it was widely assumed that the goal had been achieved. We had reached the end of ideology in the industrial world, Harvard sociologist Daniel Bell wrote. A few years earlier, as an editor of the leading business journal Fortune, he had reported the staggering scale of business propaganda campaigns designed to overcome the social democratic attitudes that persisted into the post-war years. But again the celebration was premature. Events of the 1960s showed that the great beast was still on the prowl, once again arousing fear of democracy among responsible men. The Trilateral Commission, founded by David Rockefeller in 1973, devoted its first major study to the crisis of democracy throughout the industrial world as large sectors of the population sought to enter the public arena. The naive might think of that as a step toward democracy, but the Commission understood that it was excessive democracy, and hoped to restore the days when Truman had been able to govern the country with the cooperation of a relatively small number of Wall Street lawyers and bankers, as the American Rapporteur commented. That was proper moderation in democracy. Of particular concern to the Commission were the failures of what it called the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young, the schools, universities, and churches. The Commission proposed means to restore discipline, and to return the general public to passivity and obedience, overcoming the crisis of democracy. The Commission represents the more progressive internationalist sectors of power and intellectual life in the United States, Europe, and Japan. The Carter administration was drawn almost entirely from its ranks. The right wing takes a much harsher line. From the 1970s, changes in the international economy have put new weapons into the hands of the masters, enabling them to chip away at the hated social contract that had been won by popular struggle. The political spectrum in the United States, always very narrow, has been reduced to near invisibility. A few months after Bill Clinton took office, the lead story in the Wall Street Journal expressed its pleasure that on issue after issue, Mr. Clinton and his administration come down on the same side as corporate America, eliciting cheers from heads of major corporations, who were delighted that we're getting along much better with this administration than we did with the previous ones, as one put it. A year later, business leaders found they could do even better, and by September 1995 Businessweek reported that the new Congress represents a milestone for business. Never before have so many goodies been showered so enthusiastically on America's entrepreneurs. In the November 1996 elections, both candidates were moderate Republicans and longtime government insiders, candidates of the business world. The campaign was one of historic dullness, the business press reported. Polls showed that public interest had declined even below the previous low levels despite record-breaking spending, and that voters disliked both candidates and expected little from either of them. There is large-scale discontent with the workings of the democratic system. A similar phenomenon has been reported in Latin America, and though conditions are quite different, some of the reasons are the same. Argentine political scientist Attilio Borin has stressed the fact that in Latin America, the democratic process was established together with neoliberal economic reforms, which have been a disaster for most people. The introduction of similar programs in the richest country in the world has had similar effects. When more than 80% of the population feel that the democratic system is a sham and that the economy is inherently unfair, the consent of the governed is going to be very shallow. The business press records capital's clear subjugation of labor for the past 15 years, which has allowed it to win many victories. But it also warns that the glorious days may not last because of the increasingly aggressive campaign of workers to secure a so-called living wage and a guaranteed bigger piece of the pie. It is worth remembering that we have been through all of this before. The end of history, perfection, and finality have often been proclaimed, always falsely. And with all the sordid continuities, an optimistic soul can still discern slow progress, realistically, I think. In the advanced industrial countries, and often elsewhere too, popular struggles can start from a higher plane and with greater expectations than those of the gay 90s and roaring 20s, or even 30 years ago. And international solidarity can take new and more constructive forms as the great majority of the people of the world come to understand that their interests are much the same and can be advanced by working together. There is no more reason now than there has ever been to believe that we are constrained by mysterious and unknown social laws, not simply decisions made within institutions that are subject to human will, human institutions, that have to face the test of legitimacy and, if they do not meet it, can be replaced by others that are more free and more just, as often in the past. A version of this article was originally published in South America in Spanish and Portuguese translations, 1996. Chapter 3. The Passion for Free Markets. For more than half a century, the United Nations has been the main forum for the United States to try and create a world in its image, maneuvering with its allies to forge global accords about human rights, nuclear tests, or the environment that Washington insisted would mirror its own values. So runs post-war history, we learn from the opening paragraph of a front-page story by New York Times political analyst David Sanger. But times are changing. Today, the headline reads, U.S. is exporting its free market values through global commercial agreements. Going beyond the traditional reliance on the UN, the Clinton administration is turning to the New World Trade Organization, WTO, to carry out the task of exporting American values. Down the road, Sanger continues, quoting the U.S. Trade Representative, it is the WTO that may be the most effective instrument for bringing America's passion for deregulation and for the free market generally, and the American values of free competition, fair rules, and effective enforcement, to a world still fumbling in darkness. These American values are illustrated most dramatically by the wave of the future, telecommunications, the Internet, advanced computer technology, and the other wonders created by the exuberant American entrepreneurial spirit unleashed by the market, at last freed from government interference by the Reagan Revolution. Today governments are everywhere embracing the free market gospel preached in the 1980s by President Reagan and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of Britain, Yusef Ibrahim reports in another Times front-page story, reiterating a common theme. Like it or hate it, enthusiasts and critics over a broad range of opinion agree, just to keep to the liberal-to-left part of the spectrum, about the implacable sweep of what its exponents call the market revolution. Reagan-esque rugged individualism has changed the rules of the game worldwide, while here at home Republicans and Democrats alike are ready to give the market full sway in their dedication to the new orthodoxy. There are a number of problems with the picture. One is the account of the last half-century. Even the most dedicated believers in America's mission must be aware that the US-UN relations have been virtually the opposite of what the opening passages depicts ever since the UN fell out of control with the progress of decolonization, leaving the United States regularly isolated in opposition to global accords on a wide range of issues and committed to undermining central components of the UN, particularly those with a third world orientation. Many questions about the world are debatable, but surely not this one. As for Reagan-esque rugged individualism and its worship of the market, perhaps it is enough to quote the review of the Reagan years in foreign affairs by a senior fellow for international finance at the Council on Foreign Relations, noting the irony that Ronald Reagan, the post-war chief executive with the most passionate love of laissez-faire, presided over the greatest swing toward protectionism since the 1930s. No irony, but the normal workings of passionate laissez-faire. for you. Market discipline, but not for me, unless the playing field happens to be tilted in my favor, typically as a result of large-scale state intervention. It is hard to find another theme so dominant in the economic history of the past 3 centuries. Reaganites were following a well-trodden course recently turned into a comedy act by Gingrich conservatives, when they extolled the glories of the market and issue stern lectures about the debilitating culture of dependency to the poor at home and abroad, while boasting proudly to the business world that Reagan had granted more import relief to U.S. industry than any of his predecessors in more than half a century. In fact, more than all predecessors combined, as they led the sustained assault on free trade principle by the rich and powerful from the early 1970s, deplored in a scholarly review by General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, Secretariat economist Patrick Lowe, who estimates the restrictive effects of Reaganite measures at about 3 times those of other leading industrial countries. The radical swing toward protectionism was only a part of the sustained assault on free trade principles that was accelerated under Reaganite rugged individualism. Another chapter of the story includes the huge transfer of public funds to private power, often under the traditional guise of security. The centuries-old tale proceeds today without notable change, not only here, of course, though new heights of deception and hypocrisy may have been scaled on the local terrain. Thatcher's Britain is, in fact, another good choice to illustrate free market gospel. Just to keep a few revelations of the past few months, early 1997, during the period of maximum pressure to make arms sales to Turkey, the London Observer reported, Prime Minister Thatcher personally intervened to ensure a payment of £22 million was made out of Britain's overseas aid budget to help build a metro in the Turkish capital of Ankara. The project was uneconomical, and in 1995 it was admitted by Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd that it was unlawful. The incident was particularly noteworthy in the aftermath of the Pago Dam scandal, which revealed illegal Thatcherite subsidies to sweeten arms deals with the Malaysian regime, with a High Court judgment against Hurd. That's aside from government credit guarantees and financing arrangements, and the rest of the panoply of devices to transfer public funds to the defense industry, yielding a familiar range of benefits to advanced industry generally. A few days before, the same journal reported that up to 2 million British children are suffering ill health and stunted growth because of malnutrition as a result of poverty on a scale not seen since the 1930s. The trend to increasing child health has reversed, and childhood diseases that had been controlled are now on the upswing thanks to the highly selective, free market gospel that is much admired by its beneficiaries. A few months earlier, a lead headline reported 1 in 3 British babies born in poverty, as child poverty has increased as much as threefold since Margaret Thatcher was elected. Dickensian diseases return to haunt today's Britain, another headline reads, reporting studies concluding that social conditions in Britain are returning to those of a century ago. Particularly grim are the effects of cutting off gas, electricity, water, and telephones to a high number of households as privatization takes its natural course, with a variety of devices that favor more affluent customers and amount to a surcharge on the poor, leading to a growing gulf in energy between rich and poor, also in water supply and other services. The savage cuts in social programs are placing the nation in the grip of panic about imminent social collapse. But industry and finance are benefiting very nicely from the same policy choices. And to top it all off, public spending after 17 years of Thatcherite gospel was the same 42.25% of GDP that it was when she took over. Not exactly unfamiliar here. The World Trade Organization, exporting American values. Let us put aside the intriguing contrast between doctrine and reality, and see what can be learned by examining the new era that is coming into view. Quite a lot, I think. The Times story on how the US is exporting its free market values is celebrating the WTO agreement on telecommunications. One of its welcome effects is to provide Washington with a new tool of foreign policy. The agreement empowers the WTO to go inside the borders of the 70 countries that have signed it, and it is no secret that international institutions can function insofar as they keep to the demands of the powerful, in particular, the United States. In the real world, then, the new tool allows the United States to intervene profoundly in the internal affairs of others, compelling them to change their laws and practices. Crucially, the WTO will make sure that other countries are following through on their commitments to allow foreigners to invest without restriction in central areas of their economy. In the specific case at hand, the likely outcome is clear to all. The obvious corporate beneficiaries of this new era will be US carriers, who are best positioned to dominate in a level playing field, the Far Eastern Economic Review points out, along with one UK-US megacorporation. Not everyone is delighted by the prospects. The winners recognize that fact and offer their interpretation. In Sanger's words, others fear that American telecommunication giants could overwhelm the flabby government-sanctioned monopolies that have long dominated telecommunications in Europe and Asia, as in the United States, long past the period when it had become by far the world's leading economy and most powerful state. It is also worth noting that major contributions to modern technology, transistors, to mention just one, came from the research laboratories of the flabby government-sanctioned monopoly that dominated telecommunications here until the 1970s. It used its freedom from market discipline to provide for the needs of advanced sectors of industry, generally by transfer of public funds, sometimes in indirect ways, through monopoly power, unlike the more direct modalities of the Pentagon system. Those who cling irrationally to the past see matters a bit differently. The Far Eastern Economic Review points out that jobs will be lost in Asia, and many Asian consumers will have to pay more for phone service before they will pay less. When will they pay less? For that bright future to dawn, it is only necessary for foreign investors to be encouraged to act in socially desired ways, not simply with an eye to profit and service to the rich and the business world. How this miracle will come to pass is unexplained, though doubtless the suggestion will inspire serious reflection in corporate headquarters. In the time span relevant to planning, the WTO agreement will raise phone service costs for most Asian consumers, the review predicts. The fact is, comparatively few customers in Asia stand to benefit from cheaper overseas rates that are anticipated with the takeover by huge foreign corporations, mostly American. In Indonesia, for example, only about 300,000 of some 200 million people, specifically the business sector, make overseas calls at all. It's very likely the cost of local telecom service, in general, will rise in Asia, according to David Bardun, regional telecoms analyst at JP Morgan Securities in Hong Kong. But that is all to the good, he continues. If there is no profitability in the business, there will be no business. And now that still more public property is being handed over to foreign corporations, they had better be guaranteed profitability, telecommunications today, and a far wider range of related services tomorrow. The business press predicts that personal communications over the internet, including corporate networks and interactions, will overtake telecommunications in 5 or 6 years, and telephone operators have the biggest interest in getting into the online business. Contemplating the future of his own company, Intel CEO Andrew Grove sees the internet as the biggest change in our environment at present. He expects large-scale growth for the connection providers, the people involved in generating the World Wide Web, the people who make the computers, people meaning corporations, and the advertising industry, already running at almost $350 billion annually and anticipating new opportunities with the privatization of the internet, which is expected to convert it to a global oligopoly. Meanwhile, privatization proceeds apace elsewhere. To make one important case, over considerable popular opposition, the government of Brazil has decided to privatize the Vale Company, which controls vast uranium, iron, and other mineral resources and industrial and transport facilities, including sophisticated technology. Vale is highly profitable, with a 1996 income of over $5 billion, and excellent prospects for the future. It is one of 6 Latin American enterprises ranked among the 500 most profitable in the world. A study by specialists of the Graduate School of Engineering at the Federal University in Rio estimated that the government has seriously undervalued the company, noting also that it relied on an independent analysis by Merrill Lynch, which happens to be associated with the Anglo-American conglomerate that is seeking to take over this central component of Brazil's economy. The government angrily denies the conclusions. If they are accurate, it will fall into a very familiar pattern. Side comment: communications are not quite the same as uranium. Concentration of communications in any hands, particularly foreign hands, raises some rather serious questions about meaningful democracy. Similar questions arise about concentrations of finance, which undermines popular involvement in social and economic planning. Control over food raises even more serious questions, in this case about survival. A year ago, the Secretary-General of the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, discussing the food crisis following huge rises in cereals prices this year, warned that countries must become more self-reliant in food production. The FAO is warning developing countries to reverse the policies imposed on them by the Washington Consensus, policies that have had a disastrous impact on much of the world, while proving a great boon to subsidized agribusiness, incidentally also to narco-trafficking, perhaps the most dramatic success of neoliberal reforms as judged by the free market values that the US is exporting. Control over food supplies by foreign corporate giants is well underway, and with the agreement on telecommunications signed and delivered, financial services are next in line. Summarizing, the expected consequences of the victory for American values at the WTO are: 1. A new tool for far-reaching US intervention into the internal affairs of others. 2. The takeover of a crucial sector of foreign economies by US-based corporations. 3. Benefits for business sectors and the wealthy. 4. Shifting of costs to the general population. 5. New and potentially powerful weapons against the threat of democracy. A rational person might ask whether these expectations have something to do with the celebration, or whether they are just incidental to a victory of principle that is celebrated out of commitment to higher values. Skepticism is heightened by comparison of the Times picture of the post-war era, cited at the outset, with uncontested fact. It is further enhanced by a look at some of history's striking regularities, among them, that those in a position to impose their projects not only hail them with enthusiasm but also typically benefit from them, whether the values professed involve free trade or other grand principles, which turn out in practice to be finely tuned to the needs to those running the game and cheering the outcome. Logic alone would suggest a touch of skepticism when the pattern is repeated. History should raise it a notch higher. In fact, we need not even search that far. The World Trade Organization, an improper forum. The same day that the front page was reporting the victory for American values at the WTO, New York Times editors warned the European Union not to turn to the WTO to rule on its charge that the US is violating free trade agreements. Narrowly at issue is the Helms-Burton Act, which compels the United States to impose sanctions against foreign companies that do business in Cuba. The sanctions would effectively exclude these firms from exporting to, or doing business in, the United States, even if their products and activities have nothing to do with Cuba. Peter Morici, former Director of Economics at the U.S. International Trade Commission. That is no slight penalty, even apart from more direct threats against individuals and companies who cross a line that Washington will draw unilaterally. The editors regard the act as a misguided attempt by Congress to impose its foreign policy on others. Morici opposes it because it is creating more costs than benefits for the United States. More broadly at issue is the embargo itself, the American economic strangulation of Cuba that the editors term a Cold War anachronism, best abandoned because it is becoming harmful to U.S. business interests. But broader questions of right and wrong do not arise, and the whole affair is essentially a political dispute, the Times editors stress, not touching on Washington's free trade obligations. Like most others, the editors apparently assume that if Europe persists, the WTO is likely to rule against the United States. Accordingly, the WTO is not a proper forum. The logic is simple and standard. 10 years earlier, on the same grounds, the International Court of Justice, ICJ, was found to be an inappropriate forum for judging Nicaragua's charges against Washington. The United States rejected ICJ jurisdiction, and when the court condemned the U.S. for unlawful use of force, ordering Washington to cease its international terrorism, violation of treaties, and illegal economic warfare, and to pay substantial reparations, the Democrat-controlled Congress reacted by instantly escalating the crimes while the court was roundly denounced on all sides as a hostile forum that had discredited itself by rendering a decision against the United States. The court judgment itself was scarcely reported, including the words just quoted and the explicit ruling that U.S. aid to the Contras is military and not humanitarian. Along with U.S. direction of the terrorist forces, the aid continued until the United States imposed its will, always called humanitarian aid. Public history keeps to the same conventions. The United States then vetoed a Security Council resolution calling on all states to observe international law, scarcely reported, and voted alone, with El Salvador and Israel, against a General Assembly resolution calling for full and immediate compliance with the court's ruling unreported in the mainstream, as was the repetition the following year, this time with only Israel on board. The whole affair happens to be a typical illustration of how the United States has used the UN as a forum for imposing its own values, see opening quote. Returning to the current WTO case. In November 1996, Washington voted alone, with Israel and Uzbekistan, against a General Assembly resolution, backed by the entire European Union, EU, urging the United States to drop the embargo against Cuba. The Organization of American States, OAS, had already voted unanimously to reject the Helms-Burton Act, and had asked its judicial body, the Inter-American Juridical Committee, to rule on its legality. In August 1996, the IAJC ruled unanimously that the act violated international law. A year earlier, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights of the OAS had condemned U.S. restrictions on shipments of food and medicine to Cuba as a violation of international law. The Clinton administration's response was that shipments of medicine are not literally barred, only prevented by conditions so onerous and threatening that even the largest corporations here and abroad are unwilling to face the prospects. Huge financial penalties and imprisonment for what Washington determines to be violations of proper distribution, banning of ships and aircraft, mobilization of media campaigns, etc. And while food shipments are indeed barred, the administration argues that there are ample suppliers elsewhere, at far higher cost, so that the direct violation of international law is not a violation. As the issue was brought by the EU to the World Trade Organization, the United States withdrew from the proceedings on the ICJ model, effectively bringing the matter to a close. In short, the world that the United States has sought to create in its image through international institutions is one based on the principle of the rule of force. And the American passion for free trade entails that the U.S. government may violate trade agreements at will. No problem arises when communications, finance, and food supplies are taken over by foreign, mainly U.S., corporations. Matters are different, however, when trade agreements and international law interfere with the projects of the powerful again, in conformity with history's clear lessons. We learn more by investigating the reasons for U.S. rejection of international law and trade agreements. In the Nicaragua case, State Department legal advisor Abraham Sofara explained that when the United States accepted World Court jurisdiction in the 1940s, most members of the United Nations were aligned with the United States and shared its views regarding world order. But now a great many of these cannot be counted on to share our view of the original constitutional conception of the UN Charter, and this same majority often opposes the United States on important international questions. It is therefore understandable that the United States should be far in the lead since the 1960s in vetoing UN resolutions on a wide range of issues, including international law, human rights, environmental protection, and so on, precisely contrary to the standard version repeated in the opening paragraph above. The United States advanced its lead another notch shortly after this account appeared, casting its 71st veto since 1967. When the question, Israeli settlements in Jerusalem, moved to the General Assembly, the United States and Israel stood alone in opposition, again a standard pattern. Drawing the natural conclusions from the unreliability of the world, Sofara went on to explain that we must now reserve to ourselves the power to determine whether the court has jurisdiction over us in a particular case. The long-standing principle, now to be enforced in a world that is no longer sufficiently obedient, is that the United States does not accept compulsory jurisdiction over any dispute involving matters essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of the United States, as determined by the United States. The domestic matters in question were the U.S. attack against Nicaragua. The basic operative principle was stated elegantly by the new Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, when she lectured the UN Security Council about its unwillingness to go along with U.S. demands concerning Iraq. The U.S. will behave, with others, multilaterally when we can and unilaterally as we must, recognizing no external constraints in an area deemed vital to U.S. national interests as determined by the United States. The UN is an appropriate forum when its members can be counted on to share Washington's views, but not when the majority opposes the United States on important international questions. International law and democracy are fine things, but as judged by outcome, not process, like free trade. The current U.S. stand in the WTO case thus breaks no new ground. Washington declared that the WTO has no competence to proceed on an issue of American national security. We are to understand that our existence is at stake in the strangulation of the Cuban economy. A WTO ruling against the United States in absentia would be of no significance or concern, a Clinton administration spokesman added, because we do not believe anything the WTO says or does can force the US to change its laws. Recall that the great merit of the WTO telecommunications agreement was that this new tool of foreign policy forces other countries to change their laws and practices, in accord with our demands. The principle is that the United States is exempt from WTO interference with its laws, just as it is free to violate international law at will, uniquely, though the privilege may be extended to client states as circumstances require. The fundamental principles of world order again resound, loud and clear. The earlier GATT agreements had allowed for national security exceptions, and under them Washington had justified its embargo against Cuba as measures taken in pursuit of essential U.S. security interests. The WTO agreements also permits a member to take any action it considers necessary for the protection of its essential security interests, but only in relation to three designated issues: fissionable materials, traffic in armaments, and actions taken in time of war or other emergency in international relations. Perhaps not wishing to be officially on record with an utter absurdity, the Clinton administration did not formally invoke its national security exemption, though it did make clear that the issue was national security. At the time of writing, the EU and the United States are trying to arrange a deal before April 14, when the WTO hearings are scheduled to begin. Meanwhile, the Wall Street Journal reports, Washington says it won't cooperate with the WTO panels, arguing that the trade organization doesn't have jurisdiction over national security issues. Indecent thoughts. Polite people are not supposed to remember the reaction when Kennedy tried to organize collective action against Cuba in 1961. Mexico could not go along, a diplomat explained, because if we publicly declare that Cuba is a threat to our security, 40 million Mexicans will die laughing. Here we take a more sober view of threats to the national security. There were also no reported deaths from laughter when administration spokesman Stuart Esenstadt, justifying Washington's rejection of the WTO agreements, argued that Europe is challenging 3 decades of American Cuba policy that goes back to the Kennedy administration, and is aimed entirely at forcing a change of government in Havana. A sober reaction is entirely in order on the assumption that the United States has every right to overthrow another government, in this case, by aggression, large-scale terror, and economic strangulation. The assumption remains in place and apparently unchallenged, but Esenstadt's statement was criticized on narrower grounds by historian Arthur Schlesinger. Writing as one involved in the Kennedy administration's Cuban policy, Schlesinger pointed out that Undersecretary of Commerce Esenstadt had misunderstood the policies of the Kennedy administration. Its concern was Cuba's troublemaking in the hemisphere and the Soviet connection. But these are now behind us, so the Clinton policies are an anachronism, though otherwise, it seems, unobjectionable. Schlesinger did not explain the meaning of the phrases troublemaking in the hemisphere and the Soviet connection, but he has elsewhere, in secret. Reporting to the incoming present on the conclusions of a Latin American mission in early 1961, Schlesinger spelled out the problem of Castro's troublemaking. It is the spread of the Castro idea of taking matters in one's own hands, a serious problem, he added shortly after, when the distribution of land and other forms of national wealth greatly favors the propertied classes. And, the poor and underprivileged, stimulated by the example of the Cuban Revolution, are now demanding opportunities for a decent living. Schlesinger also explained the threat of the Soviet connection. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union hovers in the wings, flourishing large development loans and presenting itself as the model for achieving modernization in a single generation. The Soviet connection was perceived in similar light far more broadly in Washington and London, from the origins of the Cold War in 1917 into the 1960s, when the major documentary record currently ends. Schlesinger also recommended to the incoming president a certain amount of high-flown corn about the higher aims of culture and spirit, which will thrill the audience south of the border, where meta-historical disquisitions are inordinately admired. Meanwhile, we'll take care of serious matters. Just to show how much things change, Schlesinger also realistically criticized the baleful influence of the International Monetary Fund, then pursuing the 1950s version of today's Washington Consensus, structural adjustment, neoliberalism. With these secret explains of Castro's troublemaking in the hemisphere and the Soviet connection, we come a step closer to an understanding of the reality of the Cold War. But that is another topic. Similar troublemaking beyond the hemisphere has also been no slight problem, and continues to spread dangerous ideas among people who are now demanding opportunities for a decent living. In late February 1996, while the United States was in an uproar over Cuba's downing of 2 planes of a Florida-based anti-Castro group that has regularly penetrated Cuban airspace, dropping leaflets in Havana calling on Cubans to revolt, also participating in the continuing terrorist attacks against Cuba, according to Cuban sources, the wire services were running different stories. AP reported that in South Africa a cheering, singing crowd welcomed Cuban doctors who had just arrived at the invitation of the Mandela government to boost medical care in poor rural areas. Cuba has 57,000 doctors for its 11 million people, compared to 25,000 in South Africa for 40 million people. The 101 Cuban doctors included top medical specialists who, if they were South African, would very likely be working in Cape Town or Johannesburg at twice the salaries they will receive in the poor rural areas where they go. Since the program of sending public health specialists overseas began in Algeria in 1963, Cuba has sent 51,820 doctors, dentists, nurses, and other medical doctors to the poorest third world nations, providing medical aid totally free of charge in most cases. A month after the South African welcome, Cuban medical experts were invited by Haiti to study a meningitis outbreak. A leading West German journal reported in 1988 that third world countries regard Cuba as an international superpower because of the teachers, construction workers, physicians, and others involved in international service. In 1985, 16,000 Cubans worked in third world countries, more than twice the total Peace Corps and aid specialists from the United States. By 1988, Cuba had more physicians working abroad than any industrialized nation, and more than the UN's World Health Organization. Most of this aid is uncompensated, and Cuba's international emissaries are men and women who live under conditions that most development aid workers would not accept, which is the basis for their success. For Cubans, the report continues, international service is regarded as a sign of political maturity and taught in the schools as the highest value. The warm reception by an ANC delegation in South Africa in 1996, and the crowd singing "Long Live Cuba," attest to the same phenomenon. On the side, we might ask how the United States would react to Libyan planes flying over New York and Washington, dropping leaflets calling on Americans to revolt, after years of terrorist attacks against U.S. targets at home and abroad. By garlanding them with flowers, perhaps? A hint was given by Barry Dunsmore of ABC a few weeks before the downing of the 2 planes, citing Walter Porges, former ABC News vice president for news practices. Porges reports that when an ABC News crew on a civilian plane attempted to take photographs of the U.S. Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean, it was told to move immediately or it would be shot down, which would have been legal under provisions of international law defining military airspace. A small country under attack by a superpower is a different matter, however. A further look at history may be useful. The policy of overthrowing the government of Cuba does not go back to the Kennedy administration, as Eisenstadt asserted, but to its predecessor. The formal decision to overthrow Castro in favor of a regime more devoted to the true interests of the Cuban people and more acceptable to the U.S. was taken in secret in March 1960. With the addendum that the operation must be carried out in such a manner as to avoid any appearances of U.S. intervention, because of the expected reaction in Latin America and the need to ease the burden on doctrinal managers at home. At the time, the Soviet connection and troublemaking in the hemisphere were nil, apart from the Schlesingerian version. The Kennedy administration also recognized that its efforts violated international law and the charters of the UN and OAS, but such issues were dismissed without discussion, the classified record reveals. Since Washington is the arbiter of the true interests of the Cuban people, it was unnecessary for the U.S. government planners to attend to the public opinion studies they received, reporting popular support for Castro and optimism about the future. For similar reasons, current information about these matters is of no account. The Clinton administration is serving the true interests of the Cuban people by imposing misery and starvation, whatever studies of Cuban opinion may indicate. For example, Polls reported in December 1994 by an affiliate of the Gallup organization found that half the population consider the embargo to be the principal cause of Cuba's problems, while 3% found the political situation to be the most serious problem facing Cuba today, that 77% regard the US as Cuba's worst friend, no one else reached 3%, that by 2-1, the population feel that the revolution has registered more achievements than failures, the principal failure being having depended on socialist countries like Russia which betrayed us, and that half describe themselves as revolutionary, another 20% communist or socialist. Right or wrong, the conclusions about public attitudes are irrelevant, again a regular pattern, at home as well. History buffs might recall that the policy actually dates back to the 1820s, when Washington's intention to take control of Cuba was blocked by the British deterrent. Cuba was regarded by Secretary of State's John Quincy Adams as an object of transcendent importance to the commercial and political interests of our Union, but he advised patience. Over time, he predicted, Cuba would fall into U.S. hands by the laws of political gravitation, a ripe fruit for harvest. So it did, as power relations shifted enough for the United States to liberate the island from its people at the end of the century, turning it into a U.S. plantation and haven for crime syndicates and tourists. The historical depth of the commitment to rule Cuba may help account for the element of hysteria so apparent in the execution of the enterprise. For example, the almost savage atmosphere of the first cabinet meeting after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion described by Chester Bowles, the almost frantic reaction for an action program, a mood reflected in President Kennedy's public statements about how failure to act would leave us about to be swept away with the debris of history. Clinton's initiatives, public and indirect, reveal a similar streak of vindictive fanaticism, as in the threats and prosecutions that ensured that the number of companies granted U.S. licenses to sell medicines to Cuba has fallen to less than 4% of the levels prior to the Cuban Democracy Act, CDA, of October 1992, while only a few of the world's medical companies have attempted to brave U.S. regulations and penalties, a review in Britain's leading medical journal reports. Considerations such as these carry us from the abstract plane of international law and solemn agreements to the realities of human life. Lawyers may debate whether the ban on food and, effectively, medicine violates international agreements stating that food must not be used as an instrument for political and economic pressure, Rome Declaration, 1996, and other declared principles and commitments. But the victims have to live with the fact that the CDA has resulted in a serious reduction in the trade of legitimate medical supplies and food donations, to the detriment of the Cuban people, Cameron. A recently released study of the American Association for World Health, AAWH, concludes that the embargo has caused serious nutritional deficits, deterioration in the supply of safe drinking water, and sharp decline in availability of medicines and medical information, leading to a low birth rate, epidemics of neurological and other diseases with tens of thousands of victims, and other severe health consequences. Health and nutrition standards have been devastated by the recent tightening of the 37-year-old U.S. embargo, which includes food imports, Victoria Britain writes in the British press, reporting the year-long AAWH study by U.S. specialists, which found hospitalized children lying in agony as essential drugs are denied them, and doctors compelled to work with medical equipment at less than half efficiency because they have no spare parts. Similar conclusions are drawn in other current studies in professional journals. These are real crimes, far more than the casual and reflexive violation of legal instruments that are used as weapons against official enemies, with the cynicism that only the truly powerful can display. In fairness, it should be added that the suffering caused by the embargo is sometimes reported here as well. A lead story in the New York Times business section is headlines exploding Cuban cigar prices. Now embargo really hurts as big smokes grow scarcer. The story reports the tribulations of business executives at a plush smoking room in Manhattan, who lament that it's really tough to get a Cuban cigar in the States these days except at prices that catch in the throats of the most devoted smokers. While the Clinton administration, exploiting the privilege of the powerful, attributes the grim consequences of economic warfare without parallel in current history to the policies of the regime from which it promises to liberate the suffering Cuban people, a more plausible conclusion is more nearly the reverse. The American economic strangulation of Cuba has been designed, maintained, and in the post-Cold War era intensified, for the reasons implicit in Arthur Schlesinger's report to incoming President Kennedy. Much as Kennedy's Latin American mission feared, the successes of programs to improve health and living standards had been helping to spread the Castro idea of taking matters into one's own hands, stimulating the poor and underprivileged in the region with the worst inequality in the world to demand opportunities for a decent living, and with dangerous effects beyond as well. There is a substantial and compelling documentary record, accompanied by consistent action based on quite rational motives, which lends no slight credibility to this assessment. To evaluate the claim that the policies flow from concern for human rights and democracy, the briefest look at the record is more than sufficient, at least for those who even pretend to be serious. It is improper, however, to have any thoughts of recollections about such matters as we celebrate the triumph of American values. Nor are we supposed to remember that Clinton, inspired by the same passion for free trade, pressured Mexico into an agreement that will end the shipment of low-priced tomatoes to the United States, a gift to Florida growers that costs Mexico about $800 million annually, and that violates NAFTA as well as the WTO agreements, though only in spirit, because it was a sheer power play and did not require an official tariff. The administration explained the decision forthrightly: Mexican tomatoes are cheaper, and consumers here prefer them. The free market is working, but with the wrong outcome. Or perhaps tomatoes too are a threat to national security. To be sure, tomatoes and telecommunications are in very different leagues. Any favors Clinton might owe to Florida growers are dwarfed by the requirements of the telecommunications industry, even apart from what Thomas Ferguson describes as the best-kept secret of the 1996 election, that more than any other single bloc, it was the telecommunications sector that rescued Bill Clinton, who received major campaign contributions from this staggeringly profitable sector. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 and the WTO agreements are, in a sense, thank you notes, though it is unlikely that the outcome would have been very different if a different mix of largesse had been chosen by the business world, suffering at the time from what Businessweek had just called spectacular profits in yet another surprise party for corporate America. Prominent among the truths that are not to be recalled are the ones briefly mentioned earlier: the actual record of Reagan-esque rugged individualism and the free market gospel that was preached to the poor and defenseless, while protectionism reached unprecedented heights and the administration poured public funds into high-tech industry with unusual abandon. Here we begin to reach the heart of the matter. The reasons for skepticism about the passion that have just been reviewed are valid enough, but they are a footnote to the real story: how U.S. corporations came to be so well placed to take over international markets, inspiring the current celebration of American values. But that, again, is a larger tale, one that tells us a lot about the contemporary world, its social and economic realities, and the grip of ideology and doctrine, including those doctrines crafted to induce hopelessness, resignation, and despair. First published in Z, March 1997. Thanks for watching the Learner's Library. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe for more.